Welcome back to History Teller YT. Today's journey takes us into one of the most important turning points in the story of Christianity and world civilization, the Great Schism of 1054. This was not a simple argument or a sudden break. It was the result of centuries of cultural tension, political conflict, theological disagreements, mistrust, pride, and tragedy. And its consequences still shape the modern world. In this series, you will travel through 1,000 years of history. You will see how two great Christian traditions, the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East, slowly drifted apart. You will meet emperors, popes, patriarchs, crusaders, monks, scholars, and ordinary believers, each of whom played a role, knowingly or unknowingly, in the final split. You will witness how misunderstandings deepened into division, how politics stirred fear and suspicion, how cultural differences hardened, and how moments of violence, especially the Fourth Crusade, turned a fragile disagreement into a lasting wound. You will also see the moments when unity seemed within reach. Councils, negotiations, bold attempts at reconciliation, and honest dialogue across centuries of separation. This is the story of a world divided, rebuilt, shaken, and reshaped. A story of human ambition and spiritual devotion. A story where history itself becomes the teacher. So sit back, relax, and let the past unfold. By the time you reach the end, you'll understand not only why the Great Schism happened, but why its echoes still matter today. Get ready, because this is a journey you won't forget. Long before the formal break of 1054, the seeds of division were already growing inside the enormous structure of the Roman Empire. When the empire was whole, Christianity developed under one political system, one emperor, and one network of cities connected by land and sea. But as the centuries passed, the center of gravity shifted from west to east. The rise of Constantinople reshaped the political map, and slowly, the spiritual one as well. After Emperor Constantine moved the capital to this new city in 330, what had once been a unified world began turning into two distinct spheres. Latin dominated in the west, Greek in the east. The bishops in each region developed their own customs, vocabulary, and approaches to theology. These differences did not feel threatening early on, but they built quiet tension. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, the eastern half survived for nearly 1,000 more years. This meant the Bishop of Rome found himself leading a region with no emperor, no strong central authority, and constant pressure from invading tribes. Meanwhile, the Patriarch of Constantinople lived beside an emperor who supported him, protected him, and sometimes tried to guide the church himself. Over time, both sides grew used to solving problems on their own. The church that once operated as one family gradually became two households. There was no single moment when unity evaporated. Instead, a slow drift shaped the mental worlds of Christians on both sides. By the early Middle Ages, the East and West respected each other, but they no longer understood each other. And that misunderstanding would become one of the deepest forces pushing the churches toward the Great Schism. The East and West did not only speak different languages. They thought differently, governed differently, and worshiped differently, though they still saw themselves as part of the same faith. In the East, theological writing often reached toward philosophy. The influence of Greek thought encouraged careful contemplation, long discussions, and subtle distinctions about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, and the mysteries of salvation. In the West, where Latin legal tradition shaped education, theology developed a tone that was more structured, practical, and concerned with clear definitions and rules. Neither approach was better or worse, but they produced different instincts and occasionally created confusion when translated across regions. Daily religious life also diverged. Eastern Christians valued a style of worship that involved elaborate rituals, strong monastic traditions, and long-standing customs. Icons played a central role in prayer, decoration, and spirituality. In the West, worship leaned toward simplicity and clarity, and the role of the Pope became increasingly tied to the idea of universal leadership. Though the two worlds still exchanged letters, visited councils, and acknowledged each other's authority, the gap widened slowly, like continents drifting apart. By the 10th century, a Western traveler in Constantinople found the churches beautiful but unfamiliar. An Eastern monk visiting Rome often felt the same. These were not enemies living in opposition, but relatives who had grown apart for so long that they no longer spoke the same cultural language. As time went on, small disagreements began to feel like warnings of a much deeper divide. More and more, Christians in the East viewed Western changes with suspicion, while Western Christians viewed Eastern traditions as evidence of stubbornness. This mutual unease made future conflicts easier to ignite and harder to repair. Even before the Schism of 1054, several moments pushed the East and West toward open conflict. One early flashpoint came during the struggle over the use of icons in the Eastern Church. The iconoclast controversy, which began in the 8th century, divided the East itself and created serious friction with the West. While some Eastern emperors tried to ban icons, the Bishop of Rome strongly defended their use, arguing that images helped ordinary believers connect with the divine. Though the controversy eventually ended with the restoration of icons, the memory of disagreement left a mark. It showed that the two churches could easily find themselves taking opposite sides on issues that touched deep religious emotions. Another source of tension was the growing question of authority. Western Christians were increasingly convinced that the Pope held universal jurisdiction over all Christians. Eastern leaders respected the Pope, but believed authority should be shared among the major patriarchates. To them, the Bishop of Rome held a place of honor, not a place of absolute command. This difference was not merely technical. It affected how each side understood unity, decision-making, and the structure of Christian leadership. Political conflict added fuel to the fire. As the Eastern Empire fought wars on its borders, it sometimes felt abandoned by the West. At other times, Western rulers acted aggressively in regions claimed by the East. Every disagreement, large or small, added one more stone to the wall rising between the churches. No one planned this result. It emerged from centuries of misunderstandings, wounded pride, and cultural distance. By the time the 11th century arrived, the relationship was fragile enough that a single clash could break it apart entirely. And in 1054, that clash finally came. By the 11th century, the political world surrounding the church was changing quickly, and those shifts strained the relationship between East and West even more. The Eastern Empire, often known as Byzantium, had survived for centuries despite repeated attacks from Persians, Arabs, and various nomadic groups. But surviving came at a cost. The empire's borders had shrunk, its resources had been drained, and its leaders were often forced to prioritize military stability over church diplomacy. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, kings were becoming stronger and more organized. New kingdoms and growing feudal networks gave the West a sense of rising confidence that contrasted sharply with the East's ongoing struggle to maintain its older structure. This imbalance influenced how the churches interacted. When the Pope looked eastward, he saw an empire that still claimed prestige but appeared increasingly vulnerable. When the Patriarch looked westward, he saw a church that seemed too eager to expand its influence under the banner of papal authority. Both sides interpreted change through their own fears. Western leaders believed the Pope needed stronger leadership powers to guide Christians in chaotic times. Eastern leaders believed decentralized authority protected the Church from political domination. Neither side understood how deeply the other relied on its own system for survival. Their political environments shaped their expectations, and those expectations became barriers to communication. As new rulers, armies, and alliances emerged, each side responded differently. Instead of adapting together, they adapted apart. That growing separation created a situation where even relatively small conflicts could feel like threats to the entire structure of Christian unity. The world was changing quickly, and the churches struggled to move through that change without losing trust in one another. Another force driving the two churches apart was competition over missionary work. As Christianity spread into Eastern Europe, both the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches aimed to guide new converts. Regions such as Bulgaria, Moravia, and parts of Kievan Rus became areas of intense religious interest. Missionaries from both sides brought their languages, liturgies, and teachings, hoping to shape the future of the developing Christian communities. On the surface, this competition looked like a race between two church traditions. But the deeper issue was about identity and authority. The East preferred that new Christians adopt the Greek liturgy and align themselves with Constantinople, reinforcing the empire's cultural reach. The West encouraged new believers to use Latin and follow Rome's guidance. When disputes arose over which church would oversee the spiritual life of a region, resentment followed. The conflict in Bulgaria is one example. After Bulgaria converted to Christianity, its rulers switched alliances between East and West more than once, hoping to gain leverage. Each switch frustrated one side and encouraged suspicion. If a region embraced Western liturgy, the East interpreted it as political pressure. When Eastern authority expanded, the West saw it as a threat to papal leadership. This tug-of-war extended beyond borders. Language itself became a point of tension. The decision of Eastern missionaries to translate scripture and worship into local languages, including the development of the Cyrillic alphabet, was celebrated in the East but criticized by some in the West. The West believed Latin preserved unity. The East believed local languages preserved accessibility. These disagreements were not harsh enough to cause a complete break on their own, but they deepened a pattern of viewing the other side as competitive rather than cooperative. Over time, missionary work, which should have connected Christians, created additional layers of rivalry and distrust. This rivalry fed into the larger narrative that the churches were heading in two different directions, even while claiming to share the same faith. At the heart of the growing divide was a disagreement that affected every other conflict: the role of the Pope. Western Christians increasingly believed the Bishop of Rome held universal authority granted by Christ. This meant the Pope could intervene in disputes across all Christian lands, settle theological arguments, and even overrule other bishops. In the West, this idea developed naturally as the Pope filled the power vacuum left by the fallen Roman Empire. Without an emperor, the Pope became both a spiritual guide and, to many, a symbol of stability and leadership. In the East, however, this idea felt foreign. The Eastern Church operated under a model of shared authority known as conciliarity. Instead of one leader making final decisions, major issues were resolved through councils of bishops. The Patriarch of Constantinople held a position of honor, but he did not claim supremacy over the entire church. When Western writings began to emphasize papal power, Eastern leaders became uneasy. They viewed such claims as overreach and potentially dangerous because a single leader could come under political influence or lose balance without the corrective voice of other patriarchs. This tension shaped how each side interpreted disagreement. When the West expected obedience, the East interpreted it as a misunderstanding of how the Church should function. When the East resisted, the West saw it as rebellion. Letters exchanged between the Pope and Eastern patriarchs sometimes carried polite wording but sharp meaning. Each side believed it was defending the true structure of Christianity. This fundamental disagreement set the stage for the events of 1054 because it created a situation where neither side could yield without feeling they had betrayed their core principles. Papal authority became the fault line beneath all other issues, and when the earthquake finally came, the ground split exactly along that line. One of the most famous theological disputes between East and West centered on a single phrase known as the Filioque clause. It was not originally a major issue, nor was it intended to provoke conflict. The phrase was added by Western churches to the Nicene Creed, stating that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. In Latin, this addition is a single word, Filioque. The East preserved the older version of the Creed, which stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone. For centuries, both sides saw their versions as natural expressions of their theological traditions. The West viewed the addition as a safeguard against misunderstandings about Christ's divinity, while the East believed altering the Creed without an ecumenical council violated the proper way of preserving doctrine. Over time, this small difference took on great symbolic weight. The West insisted the Filioque was a valid clarification rooted in earlier theological writings. The East argued that no local church had the authority to modify a creed accepted by the universal councils of the early church. The disagreement reflected deeper problems. The West emphasized clarity and doctrinal protection, while the East emphasized continuity and the authority of tradition. As communication between East and West declined, misunderstandings multiplied. Some Eastern theologians thought the Filioque implied the Spirit was somehow inferior or that the relationship within the Trinity had been altered. Western theologians responded by arguing that the Eastern interpretation misunderstood their intent. Neither side saw itself as changing the faith, yet each came to see the other as risking harm to its foundations. Because the creed was central to worship, the dispute worked its way into daily church life. What began as a regional addition turned into a long-standing symbol of division. By the 11th century, the Filioque was no longer just a theological point. It had become a marker of identity, loyalty, and alignment with either Rome or Constantinople. And symbols like these can ignite tensions much faster than technical arguments alone. Beyond theology, the two churches practiced their faith in ways that increasingly reflected their separate cultural worlds. Many of these differences were harmless and even beautiful. Yet in the tense centuries leading up to the Great Schism, they became sources of irritation and suspicion. In the East, liturgy involved long, elaborate services filled with chanting, incense, icons, and careful rituals that developed from ancient traditions. The West gradually moved toward a more streamlined liturgical structure rooted in Latin legal and monastic customs. These variations might have remained simple matters of style if not for the growing mistrust between the two sides. Small differences began to carry exaggerated meaning. For example, the type of bread used in the Eucharist became a point of contention. The West used unleavened bread, linking it to the Last Supper and Passover traditions. The East used leavened bread, seeing it as a symbol of the risen Christ. Each side developed explanations that fit comfortably within its own theological framework, but over time some leaders began criticizing the other's practice as improper. Instead of accepting diversity, arguments emerged about which form held greater authority. Even dietary rules during certain liturgical seasons contributed to mutual frustration. The East followed stricter fasting guidelines, while the West used a more flexible approach. Certain Western customs, such as eating dairy on specific days during Lent, seemed lax to Eastern believers. Likewise, Easter tradition struck some Western leaders as overly rigid. What made these disagreements harmful was not the practices themselves, but the attitudes that grew around them. As political tension increased, liturgical differences were interpreted as signs of deeper doctrinal error. By the 11th century, these rituals had become badges of identity. When delegates from East and West visited each other's churches, subtle details stood out more than shared beliefs. Worship, once a unifying act, became another reminder that their worlds were drifting apart. These ritual differences did not cause the schism by themselves, but they became emotional triggers that made reconciliation harder. Once people start viewing another community's worship as strange or untrustworthy, it becomes easier to believe larger divisions are unavoidable. Language played a quiet but powerful role in the conflict. The East lived in a Greek-speaking world where theological concepts were expressed with vocabulary developed over centuries of philosophical reflection. The West operated in Latin, a language shaped by legal precision and structured argument. As long as translators and theologians bridged the gap, the churches could communicate effectively. But after the early councils, regular communication slowed, and fewer theologians were fluent in both languages. This created a dangerous gap. When official letters arrived from Rome or Constantinople, subtle meanings were often lost, mistranslated, or interpreted through cultural assumptions rather than direct understanding. Some of the most heated disagreements grew larger simply because each side believed the other had said something far more extreme than intended. Western writings that emphasized the authority of the Pope were sometimes translated in ways that made them sound harsher to Eastern ears. Eastern theological texts, rich with nuanced vocabulary, occasionally sounded ambiguous or even suspicious when rendered into Latin. These misunderstandings fed the belief that the other side was drifting into error. Language differences also reinforced the idea that each church existed in its own intellectual universe. Western monks reading Greek works in poor translation struggled to grasp subtle ideas about the nature of Christ or the Trinity. Eastern scholars reading Latin texts sometimes felt confused by the Western style of argument. The lack of shared vocabulary made cooperation difficult even when both sides wanted peace. By the 11th century, language was more than a barrier to communication. It had become a symbol of separation. Greek culture and Latin culture had grown apart so completely that each side viewed the other's intellectual tradition through a lens of suspicion. Once mistranslation became normal, correcting misunderstandings required more effort than either side was willing to give. The wall grew taller year by year. When the crisis of 1054 arrived, this linguistic divide ensured that every angry sentence would sound sharper and every accusation would seem heavier. It shaped not just what was argued, but how it was heard. By the mid-11th century, the balance of power between East and West had shifted in dramatic and unsettling ways. Western Europe, once fragmented and vulnerable, was beginning to consolidate under stronger rulers and emerging states. The papacy had also started asserting itself more boldly through reforms that aimed to strengthen clerical discipline, separate church authority from secular interference, and centralize spiritual governance. These reforms, often associated with what historians later called the Gregorian Reform movement, reduced corruption and reinforced the Pope's role as the head of the Western Church. To Western leaders, These reforms were necessary steps that helped restore moral authority and strengthen the unity of Latin Christendom. For Eastern leaders, however, this growing confidence in Rome appeared threatening. They saw the rise of papal power not as renewal, but as expansion. Western kings and popes made alliances that often overlooked Byzantine interests, and Western armies, no longer simply defensive forces, were increasingly active across Europe. The East watched these changes with unease. The Byzantine Empire had historically served as the most sophisticated and powerful Christian state in the world, but now it found itself dealing with internal instability, military pressure from the Seljuk Turks, and diminishing influence across former imperial territories. This shift created psychological tension that colored every diplomatic exchange between the two churches. When Rome spoke with firmness, Constantinople heard dominance. When Constantinople asked for cooperation, Rome often interpreted it as hesitation or political maneuvering. The widening gap in political strength made it difficult for either side to approach disagreements calmly. The West, feeling stronger, wanted acknowledgement of papal authority. The East, feeling pressured, clung more tightly to its traditions and to the Patriarch's role as guardian of orthodoxy. This mixture of insecurity and ambition hardened attitudes on both sides. The Pope believed he was building the foundation for a united Christian world under clear leadership. The Patriarch believed he was protecting the ancient structure of the faith from unwanted innovation. Once political perceptions begin shaping religious dialogue, compromise becomes increasingly difficult. By the early 11th century, the two churches were no longer simply disagreeing. They were defending themselves against what they each perceived as existential threats. One of the most tense geographic flashpoints between Rome and Constantinople was southern Italy. For centuries, this region had been heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire. Greek-speaking populations lived alongside Latin-speaking communities, and Eastern monastic traditions flourished there. It served as a cultural and religious bridge between the two worlds. But by the 11th century, the situation had changed. Lombard nobles, local armies, and eventually Norman adventurers sought to control the region, and their ambitions drew both Rome and Constantinople into a complicated struggle for influence. From the Byzantine perspective, southern Italy was part of their sphere and had been for generations. They governed through local officials, upheld Greek rights, and maintained long-standing ecclesiastical structures connected to Constantinople. But Western rulers and reform-minded popes saw the region as an opportunity to strengthen Latin Christianity and reassert Roman authority in areas where Greek customs had remained strong. As Normans pushed Byzantine forces out of key territories, bishops who supported the Eastern tradition found themselves pressured or replaced. These changes created practical problems that grew into symbolic ones. Churches that once used Greek liturgy were compelled to adopt Latin practices. Priests loyal to the Patriarch experienced political and religious pressure to acknowledge Roman jurisdiction. In some towns, communities were split between those who favored Eastern customs and those who supported the Western reforms. Rome viewed these transitions as necessary steps to unify Christian practice under proper authority. Constantinople saw them as encroachments that violated long-standing rights and disrespected the heritage of the Greek-speaking faithful. The conflict in southern Italy contributed directly to the tension leading up to the Great Schism. When envoys traveled between Rome and Constantinople, they often carried grievances about how clergy were treated, how property was managed, and how liturgy was conducted in these contested territories. Every dispute fed suspicion. When the Patriarch heard of a Latin bishop imposing Western customs, he interpreted it as deliberate aggression. When the Pope heard complaints about Greek bishops resisting reform, he saw it as disobedience. Southern Italy became a living symbol of the broader struggle, a region where cultural identity, political control, and religious authority were locked in constant conflict. This atmosphere made compromise increasingly unlikely and set the stage for the confrontation that would erupt in 1054. Diplomatic relations between the papacy and the Byzantine Empire had always been delicate, but in the decades before the schism, they became especially tense. One major issue was the differing expectations each side held regarding political loyalty. Byzantine emperors traditionally viewed themselves as protectors of the entire Christian world, even after the empire no longer commanded the same power it once had. They expected the Pope to show respect to the emperor as a symbol of Christian leadership. But the Western understanding of authority had changed. The Pope saw himself as independent from imperial control, guided only by spiritual authority and not bound by political expectations rooted in an older era. This created awkward diplomatic moments. When popes sent letters that emphasized independence, Eastern leaders saw them as disrespectful. When Byzantine emperors expected honorific language or acknowledgement of imperial primacy, Rome grew irritated. Miscommunication reinforced resentment. Even small shifts in tone carried political meaning. A lack of certain greetings in formal letters could spark offense. A phrase asserting papal authority could be interpreted as a claim of political superiority. Another source of friction involved alliances. Western rulers sometimes supported political opponents of Byzantium, either out of practical interest or misunderstanding of local dynamics. The East viewed these actions as betrayal. At the same time, the Byzantine court often underestimated the growing political autonomy of the papacy. They expected the Pope to side with the empire automatically, but Rome increasingly made decisions based on its own agenda, not imperial tradition. Moments of cooperation did occur. Both sides understood that unity offered strength against external threats, especially as the Seljuk expansion endangered Byzantine territory. But mistrust overshadowed their efforts. When Byzantine officials attempted to negotiate support, they sometimes couched their requests in language that implied the Pope should defer to the emperor. When Rome refused, it deepened the perception that the West no longer respected the old Christian order. By the early 11th century, diplomatic communication between the two powers had become fragile. One misinterpreted phrase could escalate into a theological complaint. One political move could be seen as religious aggression. The papacy and the Byzantine court were still part of the same Christian tradition, but they no longer shared a common political vocabulary. This fractured diplomacy greatly weakened their ability to resolve disputes peacefully. When the final crisis emerged in 1054, both sides were already standing on ground shaped by decades of political frustration, wounded pride, and mutual suspicion. Patriarch Michael Cerularius, one of the central figures in the events leading to the Great Schism, was a strong-willed and politically aware leader. His personality played a major role in shaping the tense atmosphere of the 11th century. Cerularius came to power during a period when the Byzantine Empire faced serious military challenges and internal pressures. These conditions encouraged a leader who was confident, assertive, and willing to defend the authority of the Eastern Church. Cerularius saw himself as a guardian of Orthodox tradition, protecting the Byzantine Church from what he viewed as dangerous or unnecessary influence from the West. His confidence sometimes came across as confrontational, especially to Western observers who expected diplomatic restraint from a patriarch. Cerularius also lacked the patience that might have allowed him to handle disagreements with greater flexibility. He believed firmly in the established traditions of the Eastern Church and resisted anything that seemed to undermine their authority. When Latin practices spread in regions that had long followed Eastern customs, Cerularius responded quickly and decisively. He closed Latin churches in Constantinople, citing their use of unleavened bread and other Western customs as unacceptable deviations from true Christian practice. This action, while dramatic, was not simply an act of hostility. In Cerularius's mind, he was protecting the integrity of Orthodox worship, but the decision was perceived in the West as an aggressive and deliberate insult. Cerularius also had a complicated relationship with the Byzantine emperor. Although emperors traditionally oversaw major church matters, Cerularius asserted strong independence from imperial influence. He positioned himself as a powerful spiritual leader who could act without waiting for imperial approval. This confidence made him a respected figure among many Byzantine clergy, but it also contributed to heightened political tension. By the time he engaged in direct conflict with Rome, Cerularius was already accustomed to operating as a firm and uncompromising authority. His approach left little room for negotiation at a moment when diplomacy was desperately needed. When papal envoys arrived in Constantinople in 1054, they encountered a patriarch who was unwilling to accept any suggestion that the Eastern Church should adjust its practices or acknowledge papal supremacy. The stage was set for confrontation. Pope Leo IX, the other key figure in the events leading to the schism, was a very different leader, but equally influential. His papacy became one of the defining moments of the Reform movement that aimed to strengthen moral discipline and restore the independence of the Western Church from secular rulers. Leo IX was determined, principled, and deeply committed to the idea that the Pope held universal authority over all Christians. This belief shaped every diplomatic action he took and guided how he responded to challenges from both within and outside the Western Church. Leo IX saw the papacy as the heart of Christian unity. From his perspective, recognizing papal supremacy was not a matter of political ambition, but an essential truth of the faith. It was his duty to defend it. This conviction sometimes made negotiation difficult, because Leo interpreted resistance as rejection of God's plan for the church. When Leo's advisors informed him about issues in southern Italy, he viewed Byzantine influence there as improper and destabilizing. He believed that Latin liturgical practices should be followed where Latin authority had traditionally been strong. Leo IX's decision to send legates to Constantinople in 1054 reflected his desire to assert authority clearly. The envoys carried letters that firmly stated the Pope's position and criticized Eastern practices that Leo believed violated Christian unity. Some of this language was stronger than necessary, but Leo saw it as a defense of truth. His approach contrasted sharply with the sensitivity the situation required. Because Leo IX believed strongly in his mission, he underestimated the degree to which the Eastern Church viewed itself not as a subordinate institution, but as an equal tradition with ancient roots. When news reached Rome that Cerularius had closed Latin churches, Leo saw it as an attack on the dignity of the Western Church. He interpreted the action not as a local disciplinary decision, but as a challenge to Rome's rightful authority. His firm response reflected his reforming mindset, which did not tolerate what he saw as disorder or rebellion. Tragically, Leo IX died before hearing the outcome of the negotiations in Constantinople. His vision, his sense of duty, and his assertive leadership had set events in motion, but he did not live to witness how they unfolded. Had he survived, he might have offered additional guidance or tried different strategies for reconciliation. Instead, his envoys proceeded without the benefit of further instruction, adding more uncertainty to an already fragile moment. The Great Schism was not caused by personalities alone, but the temperaments of Patriarch Michael Cerularius and Pope Leo IX made the crisis far more explosive. Both leaders were deeply committed to their traditions and believed they were defending the truth of the faith. Their convictions were sincere, but they left little room for flexibility or compromise. As a result, interactions between their representatives were tense from the beginning. The meeting between the papal legates and the patriarch was marked not by calm diplomacy, but by suspicion, defensive arguments, and emotional responses. Each side brought assumptions that shaped the entire exchange. Cerularius expected respect for Eastern traditions and viewed Roman criticism as arrogance. The papal legates expected deference to papal authority and saw Eastern resistance as disobedience. Because neither side shared the same understanding of leadership, every sentence carried potential offense. Even polite phrases could be misinterpreted when placed in a broader context of competition and rivalry. There were also moments where pride overshadowed reason. Cerularius refused to meet the legates on equal terms, insisting on a level of respect that reflected the honor he believed the patriarchate deserved. The legates, especially Cardinal Humbert, displayed impatience and frustration when confronted with resistance. They issued accusations instead of seeking common ground. These reactions made it almost impossible for the negotiations to recover. In a different world, with different leaders, the crisis might have been resolved peacefully or postponed for another generation. But in 1054, the combination of political strain, theological rivalry, and strong personalities created a situation where every disagreement escalated quickly. What might have been a temporary conflict instead became a permanent divide. The schism cannot be reduced to the actions of two men, but their leadership styles shaped the tone of the conflict and hardened attitudes at the moment when unity needed patient and careful defense. Their legacies became tied to one of the most consequential breaks in Christian history, a break that neither side fully anticipated but both helped make unavoidable. The events that directly led to the Great Schism did not emerge suddenly. They unfolded through a chain of miscommunications and mutual accusations. Southern Italy became the starting point for the final breakdown. When the Normans took control of areas that had been under Byzantine influence, they pushed out Greek bishops and replaced Eastern liturgical practices with Latin ones. These actions angered Patriarch Michael Cerularius, who believed the Western Church was intentionally undermining Orthodox tradition. His frustration intensified when reports reached him that Latin clergy in the region dismissed Eastern customs as inferior. This language, whether exaggerated or true, touched a sensitive point in the long-standing rivalry between the two churches. Cerularius responded by sending letters that criticized Western practices, especially the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist. To him, this was not a personal attack on Pope Leo IX, but an attempt to defend the integrity of Orthodox worship. However, the tone of the letters struck Rome as confrontational. They arrived at a moment when the papacy was already confident in its authority and sensitive to criticism. Pope Leo IX interpreted Cerularius' messages as an attempt to reject Rome's leadership and challenge the legitimacy of Latin customs. This misunderstanding shaped the actions that followed. Instead of sending a diplomatic reply designed to soften tensions, the papacy responded with sharp language asserting papal supremacy. One letter even referenced the forged donation of Constantine, which claimed Rome had received universal authority from Emperor Constantine. Although Leo IX genuinely believed the document was real, its use in the argument made the Eastern Church view Rome as overreaching and misinformed. The written exchanges hardened positions on both sides. What might have been resolved through patient dialogue quickly transformed into a doctrinal and political confrontation. The letters served as the spark that ignited accumulated resentment from centuries of cultural divergence. By the time envoys were dispatched to Constantinople, both sides had already convinced themselves that the other represented a threat to the true form of Christianity. This mindset ensured that the mission would not simply be a negotiation. It would be a test of loyalty, identity, and authority. When Pope Leo IX sent his legates to Constantinople in 1054, he intended them to negotiate firmly but productively. The group was led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, a scholar known for his determination and his uncompromising belief in papal primacy. Although Humbert was knowledgeable, his personality was not well suited to the delicate situation in Constantinople. He lacked patience and tended to interpret resistance as defiance. This trait became a major obstacle during the mission. Upon arriving in Constantinople, the legates immediately encountered difficulties. Patriarch Michael Cerularius refused to receive them with the honors they expected. To the Patriarch, granting special recognition to papal representatives might imply acceptance of papal superiority, which he could not allow. To the legates, this refusal felt like deliberate disrespect. Their disappointment set a combative tone for the rest of the negotiations. The legates also carried letters from Leo IX that strongly asserted Roman authority. Unfortunately, the Pope died before the legates even reached Constantinople. In theory, the death of a pope ended the legates' authority, but they continued their mission without acknowledging this. The Patriarch and his advisors found this suspicious and disrespectful, fueling the perception that Rome cared more about asserting power than maintaining truth or unity. Meetings between the two sides quickly deteriorated. Instead of working toward shared understanding, each encounter became an exchange of accusations. Humbert criticized Eastern practices harshly, echoing earlier Latin complaints. Cerularius responded with equally strong objections to Western customs. Neither side attempted to separate cultural tradition from essential doctrine. Instead, every issue became a symbol of deeper disagreement. By the time formal negotiations ended, trust had collapsed completely. The legates believed the Patriarch was intentionally resisting the rightful authority of Rome. The Patriarch believed the legates were arrogant and unwilling to understand Orthodox tradition. What had begun as an opportunity to clarify misunderstandings became a public display of hostility that left no room for reconciliation. The final break had not yet occurred, but the path toward it was set. The climax of the conflict unfolded in July 1054, when the papal legates took an extraordinary and provocative step. After months of tense and unproductive meetings, they marched into the Hagia Sophia, the most important church in the Byzantine world, during a service. They walked up to the altar and placed a bull of excommunication on it, formally declaring Patriarch Michael Cerularius and his supporters excommunicated from the Western Church. This act shocked Constantinople. It was not only a bold demonstration of Roman authority, but a public humiliation. Worshippers looked on in disbelief as the legates left the church without waiting for a response. The excommunication document included harsh accusations against the Eastern Church, describing its customs as errors and its leadership as rebellious. The tone of the document reflected Humbert's frustration rather than careful diplomacy. To the Byzantines, its language proved Rome had no intention of treating the Eastern Church as an equal partner. Cerularius reacted as expected. He convened a synod and issued a counter-excommunication against the legates, not against the Pope, since he already died, but specifically against the envoys who carried out the act. This exchange of excommunications became the symbolic moment identified as the Great Schism. In reality, neither side fully understood how permanent the break would become. The legates believed they were defending the authority of the Pope. Cerularius believed he was protecting the purity of Orthodox tradition. Both sides acted from convictions shaped by centuries of cultural separation and mistrust. What made the moment irreversible was not simply the excommunications, but the emotional impact they carried. For the people of Constantinople, the act in the Hagia Sophia felt like an insult to their entire heritage. For Western leaders, Cerularius' refusal to submit to papal authority confirmed their belief that the East rejected the rightful structure of the Church. The exchange deepened resentments that already existed and created a lasting psychological divide. Although attempts at reconciliation occurred in later centuries, the events of 1054 created a wound that shaped Christian history permanently. What began as a political and theological disagreement became a full separation, reinforced by pride, misunderstanding, and the inability to see beyond centuries of accumulated tension. When the events of 1054 unfolded, the Byzantine world did not immediately interpret them as the beginning of a permanent split. Many people in Constantinople saw the excommunication by the papal legates as an abrupt and disrespectful act, but not necessarily as something that would reshape the entire Christian world. For them, the tension felt like a political confrontation rather than a religious catastrophe. Patriarch Michael Cerularius' decision to excommunicate the legates, not the Pope, reflected this perspective. He believed he was dealing with a group of overreaching envoys, not severing ties with an institution that shared ancient Christian roots. Yet the emotional impact of the event was enormous. The scene inside the Hagia Sophia left a lasting impression. Worshippers who witnessed the legates' actions felt insulted, confused, and uncertain about what the West intended. The Byzantine clergy, already suspicious of Latin customs, grew even more defensive. They believed the excommunication displayed the arrogance of Rome, confirming fears that the West wanted to impose its authority on the East. The Patriarch, supported by influential monastic communities, framed the event as part of a larger struggle to preserve Orthodox identity against foreign influence. At the same time, segments of Byzantine society hoped the dispute could eventually be repaired. Many scholars and nobles understood that Christianity had survived earlier disagreements, even significant ones, without permanent division. The empire faced military threats from the Seljuk Turks and internal political challenges, making unity with the West strategically valuable. Some advisors encouraged the emperor to treat the incident as an unfortunate diplomatic failure rather than a definitive break. However, the longer the discussions continued, the more strongly the narrative of Eastern resistance took hold. Cerularius presented himself not only as a defender of doctrine, but as a protector of Byzantine dignity. This made reconciliation politically difficult. Any attempt to compromise could be seen as capitulation. Over time, what began as a local dispute in southern Italy and a heated exchange in Constantinople evolved into a powerful symbol of deeper differences. The Byzantine world slowly adjusted to the idea that Rome was no longer a partner in shaping Christian unity, but a separate and increasingly foreign voice. The emotional and cultural distance that resulted created fertile ground for the schism to solidify into a lasting divide. In the West, the reactions to the events of 1054 took a very different shape. Many Western Christians did not initially understand the detail of what happened in Constantinople, and news traveled slowly. But when the story arrived, It was interpreted through the lens of the rising papal reform movement. For reform-minded clergy, the incident confirmed that Rome needed to assert itself more boldly to protect Christian unity. They believed the East had drifted away from the true path by resisting papal authority and clinging to customs that seemed incompatible with Western doctrine. The excommunication issued by the legates was considered legitimate by many Western clergy, even though it had been performed after the death of Pope Leo IX. Most Western Christians were unaware of that detail, and even those who knew tended to accept the action as symbolically valid. They viewed the Patriarch's refusal to submit not as a political disagreement, but as a spiritual rebellion. As a result, the events of 1050 reinforced the Western conviction that the Pope was the sole guardian of Christian unity. This belief merged easily with the reform movement already underway. The Church in the West wanted greater moral discipline among clergy, independence from secular rulers, and a unified structure centered on Rome. The confrontation with Constantinople allowed reformers to argue that deviations from papal authority led to confusion, instability, and heresy. Even Western rulers, who often resisted papal interference, saw political advantages in defining themselves against the Eastern Empire, which they viewed as culturally distant and increasingly irrelevant. To ordinary Western believers, the schism did not immediately alter daily religious life. Most had little direct contact with Eastern Christians, but as the years passed, sermons, letters, and religious texts increasingly portrayed the Eastern Church as misguided. Over time, the West built a narrative in which Rome defended truth while Constantinople defended tradition for the sake of pride. This narrative helped the schism solidify not only as a historical event, but as a theological certainty. By the generation after 1054, few in the West still believed reconciliation was likely or even necessary. The power of the papacy grew steadily in the wake of the incident. The schism allowed Rome to present itself as the central authority guiding all true Christians. This reinforced a sense of Latin identity that made future cooperation with the East increasingly difficult. What began as a local conflict had now shaped the broader outlook of Western Christianity for centuries to come. One of the most interesting aspects of the Great Schism is how slowly both sides realized its permanence. In 1054, neither the East nor the West called the event a definitive break. Many believed the excommunications were temporary and that diplomatic efforts could eventually reconcile the churches. After all, Christianity had endured disagreements over theology, liturgy, and political authority in earlier centuries without losing unity. The memory of past councils and earlier conflicts made both sides think reconciliation was still possible. For the Byzantines, the belief that the break was temporary came from practical experience. They had survived the iconoclast controversy, doctrinal debates over Christ's nature, and periodic tensions with Rome. Each time, the Church had eventually found a path back to unity. Many Byzantine theologians expected that, after tempers cooled, Rome would send new representatives with a more balanced approach. Even Emperor Constantine IX hoped that political necessity, especially the danger posed by the Seljuks, would eventually draw the West back into cooperation with the East. In the West, the lack of finality stemmed from how little ordinary clergy understood about the political dynamics of Constantinople. Most Western Christians did not view the East as an enemy, but as a distant branch of the same tradition. They assumed disagreements were manageable. Some Western leaders even expected the East to relent and recognize papal authority once the situation settled. However, deeper forces were already pulling the churches further apart. Cultural differences continued to widen. Language barriers hardened. Theological disputes became more entrenched. Political alliances shifted. Every year that passed without reconciliation made the division feel more normal. New generations grew up hearing only their own side's interpretation of events, and these interpretations became foundational stories about identity. Within a century, the schism transformed from an unfortunate diplomatic conflict into a defining separation between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. What neither side had intended became reality through a combination of neglect, pride, misunderstanding, and historical momentum. The fact that the break did not feel final at first makes its eventual permanence even more striking. It shows how fragile unity can be, and how easy it is for temporary conflicts to reshape history. After 1054, the schism did not immediately change the daily lives of ordinary Christians, but it gradually reshaped how they viewed one another. Everyday life in the Byzantine East and Latin West had already drifted apart over several centuries. These differences were not only theological or political, they were embedded in language, customs, art, education, and social expectations. As people continued living within their distinct cultural environments, the sense of being part of one united Christian world grew weaker. In the East, the Byzantine Empire remained a society deeply connected to classical Greek heritage. Greek philosophy influenced education, shaping the intellectual methods used in monasteries and schools. Learning emphasized rhetoric, logic, and the study of ancient authors alongside Christian texts. The liturgical life of the Eastern Church also remained heavily ceremonial. Feast days involved elaborate processions, incense, rich vestments, and hymns written by theologians who understood poetry as a form of worship. Icons filled churches and homes, creating a visual world where faith and culture blended seamlessly. In the West, however, the fusion of Latin culture with the emerging identities of Western European kingdoms produced a different outlook. Education in monasteries emphasized Latin grammar, canon law, and practical theological writing. Art was less focused on symbolic forms and more on narrative or instructional purpose. The feudal system shaped social life, and the church often played a stabilizing role in an otherwise fragmented political landscape. Western worship, though solemn and meaningful, was generally less elaborate than its Eastern counterpart, reflecting the practical character of Latin culture. These differences might have been sources of curiosity rather than conflict, but the schism added a layer of suspicion. Eastern Christians began to associate Latin customs with pride or innovation, while Western Christians saw Byzantine practices as overly complex or resistant to reform. Small details, such as differences in clerical clothing or the way communities observed fasts, became exaggerated markers of identity. Even holiday traditions diverged further, deepening the sense that the two worlds no longer shared a common rhythm of life. The growing separation in everyday living made theological unity increasingly difficult. When two cultures stop encountering each other meaningfully, misunderstandings multiply. Over time, the sense of estrangement became so familiar that few people on either side questioned it. What earlier generations had viewed as a temporary conflict, newer generations came to accept as normal. The experience of daily life itself quietly strengthened the schism, making the idea of reunion feel more distant with each passing decade. Language had always been a fault line between East and West, but after 1054, it became a defining barrier. Greek and Latin were more than tools for communication. They shaped how each side understood theology, law, and philosophy. In earlier centuries, bilingual scholars helped bridge cultural and intellectual gaps. Church councils drew on writings from both traditions, and theologians engaged with one another's ideas, even when they disagreed. But by the 11th century, true bilingual scholarship had declined significantly. In the Byzantine East, Greek remained the dominant language of administration, theology, and civic life. Few scholars learned Latin, and those who did often lacked deep exposure to Western ways of thinking. In the Latin West, Greek literacy had fallen sharply after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. These differences might have been sources of curiosity rather than conflict, but the schism added a layer of suspicion. Eastern Christians began to associate Latin customs with pride or innovation, while Western Christians saw Byzantine practices as overly complex or resistant to reform. Small details, such as differences in clerical clothing or the way communities observed fasts, became exaggerated markers of identity. Even holiday traditions diverged further, deepening the sense that the two worlds no longer shared a common rhythm of life. The growing separation in everyday living made theological unity increasingly difficult. When two cultures stop encountering each other meaningfully, misunderstandings multiply. Over time, the sense of estrangement became so familiar that few people on either side questioned it. What earlier generations had viewed as a temporary conflict, newer generations came to accept as normal. The experience of daily life itself quietly strengthened the schism, making the idea of reunion feel more distant with each passing decade. Language had always been a fault line between East and West, but after 1054, it became a defining barrier. Greek and Latin were more than tools for communication. They shaped how each side understood theology, law, and philosophy. In earlier centuries, bilingual scholars helped bridge cultural and intellectual gaps. Church councils drew on writings from both traditions, and theologians engaged with one another's ideas, even when they disagreed. But by the 11th century, true bilingual scholarship had declined significantly. In the Byzantine East, Greek remained the dominant language of administration, theology, and civic life. Few scholars learned Latin, and those who did often lacked deep exposure to Western ways of thinking. In the Latin West, Greek literacy had fallen sharply after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Only a small number of monks and scholars had access to Greek manuscripts, and even fewer knew enough Greek to translate them accurately. This linguistic isolation distorted intellectual exchange. Western theologians sometimes relied on incomplete or flawed translations of Greek works, which led to misinterpretations of Eastern doctrines. Eastern scholars, encountering Latin texts through limited translations, often misunderstood their intent. This meant that arguments about theology were frequently battles over misunderstood versions of the other side's teaching rather than genuine disagreements. The lack of shared language also affected diplomacy. Letters exchanged between the Patriarch and the Pope passed through translators who struggled to convey precise meaning. Words that carried subtle theological nuance in Greek might sound blunt or misleading in Latin, and the reverse was also true. These distortions fueled suspicion. The East interpreted certain Latin phrases as overly legalistic or authoritarian, while the West saw Greek expressions as evasive or inconsistent. Perhaps the most damaging consequence was the decline in shared intellectual culture. Earlier centuries had seen Christian scholars in both regions read works from Origen, Athanasius, Augustine, and Gregory the Great. These shared authorities provided common ground, even during disagreements. But as linguistic separation deepened, each side focused more on its own theologians and less on the universal tradition. The West developed scholasticism, a precise method of logical analysis rooted in Latin academic traditions. The East continued to emphasize mystical theology and contemplative spirituality. Over time, these intellectual differences became part of each side's identity. Western Christians saw their tradition as clear, reasonable, and orderly. Eastern Christians saw others as ancient, spiritual, and faithful to the mysteries of the early church. The loss of shared language ensured that these identities rarely interacted with each other in meaningful ways. As a result, unity became harder to imagine and even harder to pursue. As the two churches drifted further apart after 1054, myths and misconceptions flourished. Without regular contact, communities relied on secondhand stories, political propaganda, or theological assumptions to understand the other side. These misunderstandings played a powerful role in deepening the divide, because people began reacting to imagined threats rather than real ones. In the West, some clergy portrayed Eastern Christians as stubborn traditionalists who refused to accept necessary reforms. Rumors circulated that the East rejected certain core doctrines or embraced practices that seemed strange to Latin sensibilities. Western authors claimed that Eastern fasting customs were excessive or that Byzantine veneration of icons bordered on idolatry. Such accusations were rooted in ignorance rather than accurate observation. But once repeated in sermons or manuscripts, they shaped the perceptions of generations. In the East, myths about the West grew equally distorted. Latin Christians were often described as legalistic, prideful, and overly focused on institutional authority. Some Byzantine writers exaggerated differences in worship, suggesting that Western services were simplistic or lacked reverence. Others spread the misconception that Western theology diminished the Holy Spirit because of the filioque clause, even though Western theologians had long offered clarifications. These misconceptions took root because they echoed deeper cultural anxieties about losing control over tradition. Political motivations also contributed to the spread of false narratives. Byzantine leaders sometimes used negative portraits of the West to rally support during military or diplomatic crises. Western leaders, especially during reform movements, used criticism of the East to justify stronger assertions of papal authority. The more these portrayals circulated, the more they replaced real understanding. Myths were powerful because they filled the gaps created by isolation. Without personal encounters, it was easy to imagine the worst. Communities that had once shared the same sacraments, saints and councils began to treat each other like foreigners. Misconceptions hardened into stereotypes, and stereotypes hardened into barriers. By the time the next major contact between East and West occurred during the Crusades, these myths shaped expectations on both sides. Latin crusaders saw the Byzantines as unreliable allies, while Byzantines saw crusaders as unruly invaders. Each side interpreted the other's actions through a lens clouded by centuries of misunderstanding. The schism, born out of theological and political disputes, gained emotional and cultural weight from these myths, making reconciliation more difficult than either side had imagined in 1054. In the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire faced severe military pressure from the Seljuk Turks, who had captured large portions of Anatolia after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. This defeat shook the empire at its core. Once a dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, Byzantium suddenly found its heartland threatened and its military resources stretched thin. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos understood the gravity of the situation. Without external support, the empire risked losing not only territory, but its ability to defend the Christian world in the east. In desperation, Alexios turned to the west. Despite the schism of 1054, he believed Western aid could stabilize the empire. He sent envoys to Pope Urban II, carefully balancing humility and diplomatic strategy. His request was straightforward. He needed trained soldiers, disciplined units, and experienced knights who could reinforce Byzantine armies. Alexios expected small contingents, perhaps elite troops who would operate under Byzantine command. The emperor hoped practical cooperation would begin to repair relations with Rome. Urban II interpreted the request in a different way. The Pope saw an opportunity not only to support Byzantium, but also to strengthen papal influence over Christian warfare, unite fragmented Western nobles, and direct their aggression outward rather than inward. When Urban II preached at Clermont in 1095, the message he delivered was far broader than Alexios anticipated. He called on Western Christians to defend fellow believers and liberate Jerusalem. The idea of a massive pilgrimage army captured the imagination of thousands. Knights, peasants, and nobles alike responded with enthusiasm. Alexios was unprepared for what arrived at the imperial gates. The first waves of crusaders were undisciplined mobs, driven more by emotion than military training. They caused chaos as they passed through Byzantine lands, looting supplies and clashing with locals. Later, organized armies led by Western nobles arrived, but even they operated with a level of independence that challenged Byzantine authority. The emperor realized quickly that this was not the orderly assistance he had requested. The mismatch between expectation and reality created tension that would shape relations between East and West for decades. What began as a plea for limited support triggered a massive religious movement that neither side fully controlled. The First Crusade was underway, and with it came new opportunities for cooperation as well as new seeds of mistrust. When the leaders of the crusading armies arrived in Constantinople, Alexios I attempted to establish clear terms for cooperation. He asked the crusading nobles to swear oaths of loyalty, promising to return formerly Byzantine territories once they were liberated from the Seljuks. Many crusader leaders reluctantly agreed, though some viewed the agreements as temporary necessities rather than binding commitments. This moment captured the fundamental tension between East and West during the Crusade. In theory, they were allies fighting for a common cause. In practice, their goals, cultures, and expectations differed significantly. The Byzantines viewed the Crusaders with caution. To them, these were heavily armed foreigners with uncertain discipline, questionable motives, and little understanding of Byzantine diplomacy. The memory of previous Latin aggression in southern Italy made them even more wary. The Crusaders, on the other hand, interpreted the Byzantines through their own cultural lens. Western knights admired bravery, directness, and battlefield glory. Byzantine diplomacy struck them as suspicious, calculating, or even cowardly. They misunderstood strategic caution as lack of commitment. When Byzantine generals avoided reckless charges, Crusaders interpreted it as disloyalty. Despite these misunderstandings, early cooperation produced real victories. Byzantine forces and Crusader armies succeeded in reclaiming key territories. Yet each victory also brought new tension. Whenever Crusaders captured a city, its fate became a point of argument. The Byzantines believed these lands rightfully belonged to the empire. Many Crusaders believed their sacrifices granted them control. Communication problems increased mistrust. Language barriers made negotiations slow and confusing. Latin and Greek chroniclers described the same events, but interpreted motives differently. A cautious retreat by Byzantine forces might appear to Western eyes as betrayal. A delayed Crusader advance might seem to Byzantines like deliberate disregard for agreed strategy. This web of suspicion shaped the entire First Crusade. Predictable friction created deep emotional wounds. When Antioch was captured, arguments over its control nearly shattered the alliance. The Byzantines expected its return. The Crusaders refused. Even victory sharpened resentment rather than healing it. While both sides celebrated the final success at Jerusalem, they did so separately. The Crusaders saw it as divine triumph. The Byzantines observed from a distance, grateful for territorial recovery, but wary of what Western military power might mean for the future. Cooperation had been possible, but mutual distrust had grown alongside it. The Crusades were meant to unite Christians against external threats. Instead, they pushed East and West even further apart. Before the First Crusade, the Schism of 1054 still felt like a diplomatic rupture rather than a civilizational divide. After the Crusade, the psychological distance between East and West expanded dramatically. Nothing transformed perceptions more powerfully than witnessing each other on the battlefield, in negotiations and in daily interactions during the long journey across Byzantine lands. For the Crusaders, the Byzantine Empire no longer resembled the strong Christian civilization they had imagined. They saw signs of wealth, bureaucracy, and careful political maneuvering, traits they interpreted as decadence or lack of zeal. Western chroniclers began portraying the Byzantines as unreliable partners. Some even accused them of treachery because Byzantine strategy did not match Western expectations. A growing number of Western writers described the Eastern Church as spiritually weak or corrupted by excessive ritual. These portrayals were exaggerated, but they shaped how Western Europeans saw the East for generations. For the Byzantines, the Crusaders were equally troubling. They saw armies that lacked discipline, destroyed local resources, and challenged imperial authority. They witnessed Western knights acting without regard for Byzantine customs, diplomacy, or military hierarchy. The zeal of the Crusaders often looked like recklessness. Byzantines began referring to Western Europeans as Latins in a way that emphasized foreignness, cultural otherness, and even danger. The capture of Jerusalem magnified the divide. The Crusaders established Latin states in the Holy Land without consulting Constantinople, despite earlier agreements. These new kingdoms operated independently and often clashed with Byzantine interests. The Byzantines felt betrayed by what they saw as Western expansion under the pretext of religious warfare. The First Crusade did not create the schism, but it redefined it. Before 1054, theological and political disagreements shaped the conflict. After the Crusade, cultural stereotypes, military rivalry, and emotional resentment solidified the divide. The schism became more than a dispute between patriarchs and popes. It became a conflict between civilizations. By the end of the First Crusade, reconciliation no longer seemed like a realistic goal. Too many negative experiences had accumulated. The churches now lived in separate worlds, with separate identities and separate visions of Christian destiny. What had once been a break in relations now began to feel like a permanent fracture, one that future events would deepen even further. By the mid-12th century, Byzantium found itself in an increasingly complicated position. The First Crusade had reshaped the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean, creating Latin states that stood between the empire and its former territories. Although Byzantium recovered some land in Anatolia, its relationship with the Crusaders remained tense. The Latin states, particularly Antioch, often acted independently and sometimes directly opposed Byzantine interests. Instead of strengthening the empire, the crusading movement created new power centers that viewed Constantinople with suspicion. When news spread that Edessa had fallen to Muslim forces in 1144, Western leaders called for another crusade. The Second Crusade was presented as a mission to restore Christian authority and to support the fragile Latin states. Yet, for Byzantium, The arrival of another large Western army was not cause for celebration. Memories of the First Crusade lingered. Emperor Manuel I Comnenos, who ruled during this period, understood the potential danger of allowing massive foreign armies to pass through his territory again. He wanted to support Christian efforts, but he also needed to protect his empire from the chaos and unpredictability that accompanied Crusader movements. Manuel attempted to manage the situation diplomatically. He ordered preparations to host the crusading armies, but he also strengthened fortifications and stationed troops in strategic places to prevent disorder. His goal was to ensure that the Crusaders remained under control while passing through Byzantine lands. At the same time, he hoped to guide them toward campaigns that supported Byzantine priorities instead of reckless military adventures. But no amount of planning could fully contain the growing mistrust between Byzantium and the West. Western leaders arrived with preconceived notions shaped by the stories of earlier crusaders. They expected the Byzantines to offer unwavering support and saw hesitation as weakness or betrayal. Byzantines viewed the Crusaders as impulsive and destructive, a threat to their cities and stability. The empire struggled to maintain a middle path between cooperation and self-defense. This fragile balance made the overall atmosphere even more sensitive. Each misunderstanding carried political consequences. Each dispute added weight to an already fragile relationship. As the Second Crusade began, it was clear that the distrust forged during the First Crusade had become deeply rooted. Byzantium stood between alliances and dangers, uncertain whether cooperation or caution would create fewer long-term problems. The Second Crusade brought two major Western rulers into Byzantine lands, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany. Their armies were large and required extensive logistical support, which strained Byzantine resources. From the moment these forces entered imperial territory, tensions rose. The Crusaders expected the Byzantines to greet them as heroic liberators. The Byzantines expected disciplined troops who would respect imperial authority. Neither expectation matched reality. Conrad's army suffered from shortages, misdirection, and poor communication. Byzantine guides attempted to lead them across safer routes, but Western chroniclers claimed the guides intentionally misled them or withheld support. Whether these accusations were fair or exaggerated, they fed the growing narrative that Byzantium was not a trustworthy ally. Conrad's troops clashed with local populations, leading to skirmishes and escalating violence. Each conflict widened the psychological distance between East and West. Louis VII experienced similar problems. His army became frustrated with Byzantine caution, interpreting it as reluctance. Byzantine officials tried to balance diplomatic courtesy with practical concerns, but Crusaders often ignored instructions, assuming they knew local conditions better than their hosts. Louis, influenced by his clerical advisors, became suspicious of Manuel's strategic decisions. When he heard that the emperor was negotiating with Muslim powers, he interpreted it as betrayal, unaware that Byzantium often used diplomacy to preserve stability. These misunderstandings hardened further when both Western armies suffered defeats in Anatolia. Instead of analyzing their own strategic failures, many Western leaders blamed the Byzantines. They argued that Manuel had not provided enough support or had intentionally slowed their progress. In reality, the Crusaders were unprepared for the terrain, underestimated Turkish forces, and lacked unity. But the loss needed a target, and Byzantium became that target. By the time the Crusaders moved into the Holy Land, their trust in Byzantium had collapsed completely. Western chroniclers described the empire as deceitful, manipulative, and unworthy of Christian alliance. These accounts circulated widely in Europe, shaping public opinion for generations. Meanwhile, Byzantines saw the Crusaders as ungrateful and reckless, unwilling to understand the complexities of Eastern politics. Cooperation, once fragile, effectively disintegrated. Each side retreated into its own interpretation of events. The Second Crusade failed spectacularly, but its long-term impact was even more damaging. It deepened the schism by making reconciliation seem naive. The two halves of Christendom were no longer simply divided theologically. They were now alienated through shared memories of conflict, blame, and disappointment. When the Second Crusade collapsed, it marked more than a military defeat. It reinforced a sense of a reconcilable difference between East and West. The unsuccessful campaigns, the poor coordination, and the mutual accusations left both sides convinced that cooperation was futile. This shift in attitude had profound consequences for the future of Christian unity. The schism, once a dispute between clergy, now extended to kings, nobles, and ordinary believers who had participated in or witnessed the crusading movement. Western Christians returned home with stories that portrayed the Byzantines as unreliable partners who undermined the mission. These accounts, though often exaggerated or unfair, became accepted truth in many Western kingdoms. The narrative of Byzantine treachery spread through sermons, chronicles, and court discussions. It reinforced the idea that the Eastern Church was no longer a legitimate part of Christian unity, but a distant and compromised tradition. In the East, the failure of the Crusade validated fears that Western involvement brought chaos rather than stability. Byzantine officials who had hoped the Crusades would strengthen Christian solidarity now saw them as a political burden. The empire recognized that Western armies acted for their own interests, not for the protection of Byzantium or the shared Christian world. Eastern chroniclers described crusaders as destructive, overly proud, and disruptive foreigners who threatened peace more than they preserved it. This mutual disillusionment allowed the schism to sink deeper into the consciousness of both societies. With each failed attempt at cooperation, the memory of unity faded. New generations grew up hearing stories that emphasized difference, danger, and betrayal. The idea of a single universal church became unrealistic in practice, even if it remained theoretically desirable. The Second Crusade also shaped future interactions. When later crusades passed through Byzantine lands, they carried the emotional weight of earlier failures. Suspicion was automatic. Negotiations began from a position of distrust. Even well-intentioned leaders struggled to rebuild cooperation because the cultural and political wounds were already deep. Ultimately, the Second Crusade strengthened the permanence of the schism not through official decrees, but through lived experience. People on both sides now believe the division was natural. They no longer saw the other church as a sibling needing reconciliation, but as a rival following a different path. This shift in mindset made future conflict more likely and made unity seem impossible. History was moving toward even more dramatic confrontations that would push East and West farther apart than ever before. As the decades passed after the Second Crusade, the sense of separation between Eastern and Western Christianity moved beyond political alliances and military missteps. It began to crystallize into fully formed religious identities. These identities were not simply about theology or ritual. They touched language, culture, philosophy, and collective memory. For many Christians, belonging to either the Orthodox or Catholic world became part of their sense of self. This development did not happen overnight, but slowly, as each side leaned more deeply into its own traditions and moved further from the shared past of the early church. In the Byzantine East, orthodoxy became a central pillar of imperial identity. The empire's rulers understood that their authority rested not only on political power, but also on their role as defenders of Christian tradition. The Orthodox Church emphasized continuity with the early Christian world. The writings of the Greek fathers, mystical theology, and the use of icons were presented as treasures of ancient faith preserved through centuries of challenge. This helped the Byzantines maintain a strong sense of spiritual stability even as their political fortunes rose and fell. Orthodoxy became a source of cultural pride, a reminder that the Eastern Church had resisted foreign influence and held fast to the core of Christian belief. In the Latin West, Catholic identity took shape around the authority of the papacy and the spread of scholastic thought. The reforms of the 11th and 12th centuries strengthened the organizational structure of the Church, making the Pope a central figure in both doctrine and discipline. Western theologians began developing detailed systems of thought that expressed faith through logic and structured argumentation. Universities emerged as centers of learning, and Latin became the language of intellectual life. Rituals and customs were codified, spreading uniformity across regions that had once worshipped in diverse local styles. This parallel development of identity created an emotional distance that was more powerful than any theological dispute. People in each world began to see their own tradition as complete and self-sufficient, needing nothing from the other. The East considered its spirituality older and purer. The West viewed its administrative unity and clarity of doctrine as evidence of divine guidance. Before the schism, Christians on both sides assumed that unity was the natural order of the Church. After the schism, unity began to seem like an ideal rather than a reality. The cultures of East and West were diverging so far that many Christians no longer felt connected to believers across the divide. Identity hardened into habit. Habit became conviction, and conviction built walls stronger than any political boundary. Another factor that deepened the separation was the growing distinction between Eastern and Western approaches to theology. These were not simple disagreements about doctrine. They reflected different intellectual traditions shaped by centuries of cultural development. As these traditions matured independently, they gave East and West unique ways of understanding God, the Church, and the spiritual life. In the East, theology became increasingly associated with mystical experience. Byzantine writers emphasized encountering God through worship, prayer, and contemplative silence. They believed that certain divine truths could not be fully captured in words or logical definitions. Instead, they were revealed through participation in the life of the Church, through the sacraments, and through personal transformation. Eastern theologians often used poetic language and symbolic imagery, drawing from Scripture, early councils, and the spiritual writings of monks who lived in isolation for years. This approach created a deep sense of awe and transcendence. It emphasized that the ultimate nature of God remained beyond human comprehension. In the West, theology developed a more systematic structure. Thinkers like Anselm of Canterbury and later Thomas Aquinas examined faith through precise logic and philosophical reasoning. Western theologians believed that intellectual clarity strengthened Christian doctrine and helped believers understand their relationship with God. They wrote detailed treatises that explained the principles of faith step by step. This method, known as scholasticism, became one of the hallmarks of Western Christianity. It shaped education in universities and guided the development of canon law, which provided a legal framework for governing the Church. These differences were not inherently opposed, but without constant communication, they became symbols of contrast. Western theologians sometimes viewed Eastern mysticism as vague or lacking structure. Eastern theologians believed Western logic could limit the sense of mystery that was essential to spiritual life. This divergence reinforced the idea that each tradition represented a unique and correct path. As theological styles drifted apart, misunderstandings increased. Concepts described clearly in one tradition could sound strange or incomplete when read through the lens of the other. When each side stopped learning from the other, the intellectual worlds grew further apart. The schism became not just a matter of authority, but a reflection of how differently Christians in East and West approached the search for truth itself. These philosophical contrasts did not make reconciliation impossible, but they made it harder. Even when leaders attempted dialogue, their words carried meanings shaped by their own traditions. Without shared intellectual foundations, unity felt increasingly distant. While political events and military conflicts played obvious roles in deepening the schism, another powerful force shaped the divide quietly: the stories people told. Literature, sermons, hymns, and historical writings created a lasting emotional and cultural memory that influenced how each side understood the other. These stories were often shaped by pride, fear, or misunderstanding, and they became part of the public consciousness in both regions. In the West, chroniclers of the Crusades described Byzantines as unreliable allies. Writers who had never visited Constantinople repeated these claims, weaving them into narratives that explained the failures of military campaigns. The idea of Byzantine treachery became popular even among people who had no direct contact with the East. Preachers used these stories to remind Western Christians of their duty to remain loyal to Rome and to be wary of Eastern influence. Over time, the Eastern Church began to appear as an outsider to the Western imagination, no longer a sister tradition, but an estranged relative whose practices seemed suspicious or outdated. In the East, Byzantine historians defended Orthodox tradition by portraying Latin Christians as overly aggressive, disrespectful of sacred customs, and driven by ambition. These narratives emphasized episodes where crusaders had behaved badly in Byzantine territory. They described Western theology as overly rational and lacking the spiritual depth of the Orthodox tradition. Monastic writers, in particular, helped shape the public perception of Latins as outsiders who brought disorder wherever they went. The more these stories circulated, the more Eastern Christians associated the West with danger, instability, and cultural intrusion. Public memory magnified these misunderstandings. A single negative encounter could be retold for decades, gaining embellishments with each retelling. Events that might have seemed small to diplomats became legendary in local stories. When new disputes arose, people interpreted them through the lens of the past, making reconciliation feel improbable. Literature also preserved feelings of pride. Both sides believed they were the true heirs of early Christianity. The East emphasized its unbroken tradition and connection to the ancient councils. The West celebrated its administrative strength and the leadership of the papacy. These competing visions shaped not just how Christians saw the past, but how they imagined the future. As these narratives deepened, they formed invisible walls that separated the two worlds more effectively than any political decree. Even when leaders attempted dialogue or expressed interest in unity, they faced the weight of centuries of stories that framed the other side as foreign or flawed. Public memory became one of the strongest forces making the schism feel permanent. When people grow up hearing stories that define another community as distant or dangerous, it becomes difficult to see that community as a partner. By the 12th century, The walls built by memory were nearly as solid as the walls of cities. And in the decades to come, new events would reinforce them even further, leading to some of the most devastating confrontations in Christian history. By the late 12th century, the Byzantine Empire was no longer the dominant force it had once been. The empire had endured internal conflicts, external threats, and political instability that steadily weakened its ability to control its territories. Emperors changed frequently, sometimes through rebellion, sometimes through political intrigue. Each change created uncertainty, and the empire's strength became increasingly dependent on the personalities of individual rulers rather than stable institutions. At the same time, Western Europe was experiencing an era of expansion. The Second Crusade brought two major Western rulers into Byzantine lands, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany. Their armies were large and required extensive logistical support, which strained Byzantine resources. From the moment these forces entered imperial territory, tensions rose. The Crusaders expected the Byzantines to greet them as heroic liberators. The Byzantines expected disciplined troops who would respect imperial authority. Neither expectation matched reality. Conrad's army suffered from shortages, misdirection, and poor communication. Byzantine guides attempted to lead them across safer routes, but Western chroniclers claimed the guides intentionally misled them or withheld support. Whether these accusations were fair or exaggerated, they fed the growing narrative that Byzantium was not a trustworthy ally. Conrad's troops clashed with local populations, leading to skirmishes and escalating violence. Each conflict widened the psychological distance between East and West. Louis VII experienced similar problems. His army became frustrated with Byzantine caution, interpreting it as reluctance. Byzantine officials tried to balance diplomatic courtesy with practical concerns, but Crusaders often ignored instructions, assuming they knew local conditions better than their hosts. Louis, influenced by his clerical advisors, became suspicious of Manuel's strategic decisions. When he heard that the emperor was negotiating with Muslim powers, he interpreted it as betrayal, unaware that Byzantium often used diplomacy to preserve stability. These misunderstandings hardened further when both Western armies suffered defeats in Anatolia. Instead of analyzing their own strategic failures, many Western leaders blamed the Byzantines. They argued that Manuel had not provided enough support or had intentionally slowed their progress. In reality, the Crusaders were unprepared for the terrain, underestimated Turkish forces, and lacked unity. But the loss needed a target, and Byzantium became that target. By the time the Crusaders moved into the Holy Land, their trust in Byzantium had collapsed completely. Western chroniclers described the empire as deceitful, manipulative, and unworthy of Christian alliance. These accounts circulated widely in Europe, shaping public opinion for generations. Meanwhile, Byzantines saw the Crusaders as ungrateful and reckless, unwilling to understand the complexities of Eastern politics. Cooperation, once fragile, effectively disintegrated. Each side retreated into its own interpretation of events. The Second Crusade failed spectacularly, but its long-term impact was even more damaging. It deepened the schism by making reconciliation seem naive. The two halves of Christendom were no longer simply divided theologically. They were now alienated through shared memories of conflict, blame, and disappointment. By the end of the 12th century, the Byzantine Empire found itself surrounded by challenges and unsure of how to navigate them. Its relationship with the West grew more fragile as Western power expanded. The early schism of 1054 had begun as a dispute between churches. Now, the realities of political imbalance made that religious divide even deeper. Byzantium's vulnerability opened the door to events that would soon lead to one of the darkest moments in Christian history. As Western Europe prepared for the Third Crusade in the late 12th century, the political and emotional distance between East and West grew even wider. Although the primary goal of this crusade was the recovery of Jerusalem after its capture by Saladin, the movement carried with it cultural assumptions shaped by decades of conflict and mistrust. Crusaders who traveled eastward saw themselves as champions of God, but they also carried deep suspicion toward Byzantium. They expected the empire to support them without hesitation and interpreted Byzantine caution as betrayal. For the Byzantines, the Crusaders were no longer simply Western soldiers passing through imperial lands. They had become unpredictable political forces. Their sheer numbers and military power could destabilize regions simply by moving through them. Byzantine leaders understood that any miscommunication or strategic disagreement could escalate into armed conflict. Their experiences with the First and Second Crusades had shown that Western armies could not be controlled through diplomacy alone. Emperor Isaac II Angelos, who ruled during part of this period, faced enormous pressure. He wanted to maintain alliances with Western rulers to secure support against enemies such as the Bulgarians and Turks. At the same time, he needed to protect Byzantine sovereignty from Crusader interference. The balance was delicate, and Isaac's inconsistent leadership often made the situation worse. Latin leaders criticized Byzantium for signing treaties with Muslim powers. For the Byzantines, these treaties were necessary tools of survival. Diplomatic flexibility had always been a hallmark of Byzantine strategy. But Crusaders, driven by religious zeal, saw such diplomacy as weakness or betrayal. Accusations circulated that the Byzantines cared more about preserving their empire than supporting Christian unity. Byzantines responded by saying that Westerners lacked understanding of Eastern politics and endangered all Christians through rash decisions. Trade and commerce also added pressure. Venice, which played a major role in Mediterranean trade, gained increasing influence over Byzantine shipping routes. Tensions escalated when local merchants clashed with Venetians, Genoese, or Pisans competing for dominance. These conflicts sometimes turned violent, feeding a growing atmosphere of hostility in Constantinople and other cities. By the time the Third Crusade ended, both East and West had become convinced that cooperation was nearly impossible. Crusaders blamed the Byzantines for delays and setbacks. Byzantines blamed Crusaders for arrogance and disruption. The schism had now entered a stage where mutual suspicion shaped every diplomatic or military decision. This widening gulf laid the emotional groundwork for the Fourth Crusade. When that crusade arrived, fueled by debt, ambition, and miscalculation, it would collide with the fragile Byzantine world and unleash a tragedy that transformed the schism forever. Segment 3. The Seeds of Violence, Anti-Latin Riots, and Byzantine Resentment. As tension grew between Byzantines and Westerners, moments of violence began to erupt within the empire itself. The most significant of these outbreaks was the series of anti-Latin riots that occurred in Constantinople during the late 12th century. These riots were not spontaneous. They grew out of years of resentment, fear, and competition. The Latin merchant communities in the city had acquired wealth and privileges that many native citizens considered unfair. Their growing influence in trade and politics made them easy targets when frustration boiled over. The riots reflected deep emotional wounds. Byzantine citizens attacked Latin shops, warehouses, and homes. Clergy from both sides were drawn into the conflict, and religious tensions mixed with economic anger. Many Latin residents were killed, while others fled the city. The violence shocked Western Europe, reinforcing the belief that Byzantines were hostile to Latins and unworthy of trust. Western chroniclers depicted the riots as proof that the Byzantine Empire was unstable, corrupt, and increasingly anti-Christian. For the Byzantines, the riots expressed anger at what they saw as Western exploitation. Venetians, in particular, had gained immense economic power in the empire through trading privileges granted by earlier emperors. Many locals believed this power was eroding the empire's economy and threatening its independence. When political tensions increased, the anger directed at Latin merchants exploded into widespread violence. The riots also damaged the empire's diplomatic standing. The Pope condemned the violence, and Western rulers demanded justice. Isaac II Angelos attempted to restore order, but the damage was done. The West viewed Byzantium as a hostile, unreliable partner. The East felt increasingly cornered by Western interests. This climate of mutual hostility laid the groundwork for what would follow. The Fourth Crusade would not begin with a desire to attack Constantinople. But when political opportunity and financial pressure aligned, the existing resentment made such an attack easier to justify in Western minds. The anti-Latin riots demonstrated how deeply the schism had entered public life. What began in 1054 as a theological disagreement had become a cultural and emotional conflict that ordinary people felt in their daily interactions. The violence showed how fragile relations had become and foreshadowed the greatest disaster the Byzantine Empire would face at the hands of Western Christians. The stage was now set for one of history's most tragic collisions between the two halves of Christendom. The Fourth Crusade, launched at the turn of the 13th century, began with grand expectations. Western leaders intended to strike at Muslim power in the Eastern Mediterranean and reclaim Jerusalem, which had fallen again after brief Christian control. But from its earliest stages, the crusade was shaped by financial pressure, political manipulation, and poor planning. The forces that gathered in Western Europe were ambitious but lacked clear direction. Their enthusiasm did not match their resources. The Crusaders made a contract with Venice to provide ships for transport. Venice agreed to supply a massive fleet, but only if the Crusaders paid a fee far larger than what they ultimately collected. When the time came to depart, the Crusaders found themselves deeply in debt. Venice, unwilling to suffer economic loss, pressured them to assist in the capture of Zara, a Christian city that had rebelled against Venetian influence. This attack violated papal commands and shocked many crusaders who believed their mission was spiritual, not political. Pope Innocent III condemned the assault, but he struggled to control the crusading army from afar. His authority, though immense in theory, could not restrain the practical needs and ambitions of the armed forces that had drifted away from their original purpose. The capture of Zara set a dangerous precedent. The crusade had already attacked Christians instead of Muslims, demonstrating how easily its goals could be redirected. At this vulnerable moment, Byzantine politics drew the Crusaders into a new and unexpected direction. Prince Alexios IV Angelos, the son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, promised the Crusaders immense rewards if they would help him reclaim the throne. He offered money, military support, and, crucially, reunion with the Roman Church. The promise of wealth appealed to the debt-ridden Crusaders, while the idea of reuniting the churches appealed to Pope Innocent III. This combination of motives steered the crusade toward Constantinople. What had begun as a mission to reclaim Jerusalem transformed into a political intervention in Byzantine affairs. The Crusaders believed they could restore order in the empire, secure payment, and fulfill a spiritual goal by healing the schism. But they failed to understand the internal dynamics of Byzantium or the deep mistrust many Byzantines felt toward the West. As the Crusaders set sail for Constantinople in 1203, they carried with them not only weapons but also assumptions shaped by decades of cultural misunderstanding. They thought they were liberators. Many Byzantines saw them as invaders. The stage was set for a catastrophe that would reshape the schism permanently. When the Crusaders and Venetian forces reached Constantinople in 1203, the Byzantines were stunned. The empire was already weakened by years of political instability, heavy taxation, and internal rebellion. Its leadership lacked unity, and its defenses were not prepared to face a combined Western naval and land assault. At first, the Crusaders attempted to present themselves as allies. They demanded that the reigning emperor, Alexios III, step aside and restore Isaac II and his son, Alexios IV, to the throne. The Byzantines, already suspicious, resented the idea that foreign armies had the right to influence imperial succession. Tension grew quickly as crowds gathered in the streets, debating whether to resist or negotiate. After several clashes and displays of military strength, Alexios III fled the city, and the Crusaders installed Isaac II and Alexios for his co-emperors. But the arrangement was unstable from the beginning. The Crusaders expected immediate payment for their assistance, while the new emperors struggled to gather the funds. Heavy taxation sparked protests, and resentment toward Latin influence intensified. Many Byzantines blamed the new rulers for humiliating the empire by relying on foreign armies. By early 1204, the situation deteriorated beyond repair. The Crusaders, already frustrated by delays and shortages, faced growing hostility from the population. Negotiations collapsed, and a violent confrontation erupted. The Crusaders launched a full-scale assault on Constantinople, breaching its mighty walls after fierce fighting. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in medieval history. The city, famous for its beauty and culture, was plundered for 3 days. Churches were desecrated. Icons were smashed or stolen. Relics were carried off to Western cathedrals. Homes and palaces were looted. Citizens were assaulted, enslaved, or killed. When the Crusaders and Venetian forces reached Constantinople in 1203, the Byzantines were stunned. The empire was already weakened by years of political instability, heavy taxation, and internal rebellion. Its leadership lacked unity, and its defenses were not prepared to face a combined Western naval and land assault. At first, the Crusaders attempted to present themselves as allies. They demanded that the reigning emperor, Alexios III, step aside and restore Isaac II and his son, Alexios IV, to the throne. The Byzantines, already suspicious, resented the idea that foreign armies had the right to influence imperial succession. Tension grew quickly as crowds gathered in the streets, debating whether to resist or negotiate. After several clashes and displays of military strength, Alexios III fled the city, and the Crusaders installed Isaac II and Alexios for his co-emperors. But the arrangement was unstable from the beginning. The Crusaders expected immediate payment for their assistance, while the new emperors struggled to gather the funds. Heavy taxation sparked protests, and resentment toward Latin influence intensified. Many Byzantines blamed the new rulers for humiliating the empire by relying on foreign armies. By early 1204, the situation deteriorated beyond repair. The Crusaders, already frustrated by delays and shortages, faced growing hostility from the population. Negotiations collapsed, and a violent confrontation erupted. The Crusaders launched a full-scale assault on Constantinople, breaching its mighty walls after fierce fighting. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in medieval history. The city, famous for its beauty and culture, was plundered for 3 days. Churches were desecrated. Icons were smashed or stolen. Relics were carried off to Western cathedrals. Homes and palaces were looted. Citizens were assaulted, enslaved, or killed. When the Crusaders and Venetian forces reached Constantinople in 1203, the Byzantines were stunned. The empire was already weakened by years of political instability, heavy taxation, and internal rebellion. Its leadership lacked unity, and its defenses were not prepared to face a combined Western naval and land assault. At first, the Crusaders attempted to present themselves as allies. They demanded that the reigning emperor, Alexios III, step aside and restore Isaac II and his son, Alexios IV, to the throne. The Byzantines, already suspicious, resented the idea that foreign armies had the right to influence imperial succession. Tension grew quickly as crowds gathered in the streets, debating whether to resist or negotiate. After several clashes and displays of military strength, Alexios III fled the city, and the Crusaders installed Isaac II and Alexios IV as co-emperors. But the arrangement was unstable from the beginning. The Crusaders expected immediate payment for their assistance, while the new emperors struggled to gather the funds. Heavy taxation sparked protests, and resentment toward Latin influence intensified. Many Byzantines blamed the new rulers for humiliating the empire by relying on foreign armies. By early 1204, the situation deteriorated beyond repair. The Crusaders, already frustrated by delays and shortages, faced growing hostility from the population. Negotiations collapsed, and a violent confrontation erupted. The Crusaders launched a full-scale assault on Constantinople, breaching its mighty walls after fierce fighting. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in medieval history. The city, famous for its beauty and culture, was plundered for 3 days. Churches were desecrated. Icons were smashed or stolen. Relics were carried off to Western cathedrals. Homes and palaces were looted. Citizens were assaulted, enslaved, or killed. When the Crusaders and Venetian forces reached Constantinople in 1203, the Byzantines were stunned. The empire was already weakened by years of political instability, heavy taxation, and internal rebellion. Its leadership lacked unity, and its defenses were not prepared to face a combined Western naval and land assault. At first, the Crusaders attempted to present themselves as allies. They demanded that the reigning emperor, Alexios III, step aside and restore Isaac II and his son, Alexios IV, to the throne. The Byzantines, already suspicious, resented the idea that foreign armies had the right to influence imperial succession. Tension grew quickly as crowds gathered in the streets, debating whether to resist or negotiate. After several clashes and displays of military strength, Alexios III fled the city, and the Crusaders installed Isaac II and Alexios IV as co-emperors. But the arrangement was unstable from the beginning. The Crusaders expected immediate payment for their assistance, while the new emperors struggled to gather the funds. Heavy taxation sparked protests, and resentment toward Latin influence intensified. Many Byzantines blamed the new rulers for humiliating the empire by relying on foreign armies. By early 1204, the situation deteriorated beyond repair. The Crusaders, already frustrated by delays and shortages, faced growing hostility from the population. Negotiations collapsed, and a violent confrontation erupted. The Crusaders launched a full-scale assault on Constantinople, breaching its mighty walls after fierce fighting. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in medieval history. The city, famous for its beauty and culture, was plundered for 3 days. Churches were desecrated. Icons were smashed or stolen. Relics were carried off to Western cathedrals. Homes and palaces were looted. Citizens were assaulted, enslaved, or killed. After the catastrophic events of the Fourth Crusade and the long occupation of Constantinople, any attempt to heal the schism faced nearly impossible odds. Yet political reality eventually forced both East and West to consider reconciliation. When Michael VIII Palaiologos restored the Byzantine Empire in 1261, he inherited a weakened state surrounded by enemies. The Latin world remained hostile, and powerful Western leaders still dreamed of reclaiming Constantinople for a Latin ruler. Michael understood that political survival required diplomacy, not isolation. At the same time, the papacy had its own motivations. Popes wanted to reunite Christendom under Roman authority, believing the unified church could direct military and spiritual energy more effectively. They also wanted to resolve the embarrassment of the Fourth Crusade, which had damaged the church's reputation in ways Western leaders did not fully acknowledge. These political and spiritual motivations converged at the Second Council of Lyons in 1274, one of the earliest formal attempts to heal the schism. Michael VIII sent representatives to the council, instructing them to negotiate a compromise acceptable enough to satisfy Rome while avoiding domestic backlash in Byzantium. He hoped that if the West recognized the restored Byzantine Empire as legitimate, he could secure peace on his western borders and focus on defending the empire against growing Turkish threats in the east. At Lyons, the Byzantine envoys agreed to recognize papal primacy and to accept the Filio Clause. Rome celebrated the decision as a triumph of unity and a confirmation of papal authority. Western leaders believed the schism was finally on a path toward resolution, but the agreement had little support in Byzantium itself. Clergy, monks, and ordinary citizens reacted with hostility when they learned that their emperor had accepted Western theological formulations without broad consultation. The memory of 1204 was still vivid, and many Byzantines believed reunion would mean surrendering their traditions to the very forces that had devastated their capital. Opposition grew among aristocrats and church leaders who considered Michael's policies political concessions rather than genuine theological reconciliation. Monastic communities, especially those on Mount Athos, became vocal critics of the agreement, labeling it spiritually dangerous. Riots and protests erupted in various regions, and local bishops refused to implement the union. Michael VIII tried to enforce compliance through political pressure, but resistance only made the issue more contentious. In the end, the union achieved at Lyons survived only as long as Michael VIII himself. After his death, the agreement collapsed completely. The Council of Lyons became an example of how political necessity could not overcome deep emotional and cultural resistance. The schism remained intact, and many Byzantines viewed the failed attempt as further proof that unity with the West was incompatible with the preservation of Orthodox identity. Despite its failure, the Council revealed a pattern that would shape future attempts at reunion. Political leaders might be willing to compromise, but the convictions of clergy and laypeople held much greater power over the fate of the schism. One of the most powerful forces preventing reunion between East and West after the 13th century was monastic opposition. Monks in both traditions held significant influence over spiritual life, theological thought, and public opinion. Their writings and teachings shaped how ordinary believers understood the schism. Because monasteries preserved tradition and guarded the continuity of the faith, their resistance carried profound weight. In the Byzantine East, monastic communities saw themselves as protectors of Orthodox purity. They viewed Western theology and papal claims not merely as different interpretations, but as potential threats to the truth of the faith. They remembered the violence of the Fourth Crusade, the destruction of sacred spaces, and the attempts to impose Latin bishops in their churches. To many monks, union with Rome was synonymous with surrender. Their influence was immense. Monasteries like those on Mount Athos housed scholars, theologians, and spiritual leaders whose opinions carried greater authority among the faithful than those of emperors or diplomats. When Michael VIII attempted to enforce the Union of Lions, monks condemned the act publicly. They refused to commemorate the Pope in the liturgy, a symbolic rejection that made the union meaningless in everyday worship. This monastic resistance created a psychological barrier to reunion. The faithful internalized the idea that orthodoxy could only survive if it remained separate from the West. Over time, separation became part of the Orthodox Christian identity itself. Every attempt at negotiation or compromise was interpreted as a threat to survival, not an opportunity for unity. In the West, monastic attitudes also shaped perceptions of the East. Some Western monks admired Byzantine spirituality, but many viewed Orthodox resistance as stubbornness or pride. Latin writings often portrayed Eastern theology as overly mystical, lacking the clarity and structure of Western scholasticism. These portrayals strengthened Western confidence in the correctness of papal authority and reinforced the belief that reconciliation could only occur if the East accepted Roman leadership. The growing psychological distance between East and West made theological dialogue harder. Even when theologians found areas of agreement, their conclusions struggled to overcome the emotional narratives held by the wider religious communities. The schism was no longer just an institutional conflict. It had become a deeply rooted worldview. By the 14th century, monastic resistance on both sides had solidified into a cultural norm. Attempts at reunion had to contend not only with doctrinal disagreements, but with centuries of accumulated distrust and emotional wounds. This was a far greater challenge than any council or diplomatic mission could easily overcome. The most ambitious attempt to reunite the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches came in the 15th century at the Council of Florence. By this time, the Byzantine Empire was on the brink of collapse. The Ottoman Turks had seized much of its territory and now surrounded Constantinople itself. The empire lacked the military strength to resist on its own. Emperor John VIII Palaiologos believed that reunification with Rome could secure Western military aid and delay or prevent the fall of the empire. For the papacy, the council was an opportunity to achieve what previous generations had failed to accomplish: a complete and formal reconciliation of the two churches under Roman authority. Pope Eugene IV welcomed the Byzantine delegation with great ceremony, hoping the discussions would produce a unified Christian front that could defend Europe from the Ottoman threat. The council brought together theologians, bishops, and political leaders from both traditions. Debates lasted for months. Participants discussed the filio clause, the nature of papal primacy, the use of leavened or unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and other long-standing issues. In many areas, the delegates found common ground. Skilled theologians clarified misunderstandings and demonstrated that many disagreements were more about language and custom than doctrine. Political pressure, however, loomed over the discussions. John VIII knew that without Western support, Constantinople could fall. Many Eastern delegates felt this urgency and reluctantly accepted compromises. In 1439, the council announced a formal union, proclaiming that the schism had ended and that both churches recognized the authority of the Pope. Western leaders celebrated, believing the centuries-long division had finally been healed. But the reality in the East was very different. When the Byzantine delegation returned home, they were met with outrage. The people rejected the union almost unanimously. Monks denounced the agreement as a betrayal of the Orthodox faith. Clergy refused to implement the changes. Patriarchs appointed after the council openly opposed the union, insisting that orthodoxy could never submit to papal authority. Political circumstances soon made the entire agreement meaningless. Western military support never materialized on a scale large enough to save Constantinople. In 1453, just 14 years after the council, the city fell to the Ottomans. The Byzantine Empire came to an end, and with it the last major effort to heal the schism faded. The Council of Florence demonstrated both the possibility and impossibility of reunion. Theologically, the churches could find common ground. Politically and culturally, unity was unattainable. The memories of 1204, the weight of tradition and the strength of Orthodox identity were stronger than any council's decisions. By the mid-15th century, the Great Schism had become not only a historical reality, but a permanent feature of the Christian world. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist, but the Orthodox Church endured. The collapse of imperial power forced orthodoxy into a new role that differed sharply from its centuries-long connection to the state. Instead of functioning alongside a Christian emperor, the church now had to navigate life within a Muslim-led empire. Surprisingly, this new environment both limited and strengthened orthodoxy in unexpected ways. The Ottomans understood the importance of maintaining stability in their vast and diverse territories. Although they were Muslim rulers, they allowed religious minorities to practice their faiths under a system known as the millet structure. The Orthodox Church became the spiritual and administrative head of the Christian millet, responsible for collecting taxes, overseeing education, and maintaining internal discipline. This arrangement gave the Patriarch of Constantinople significant authority, though it came with heavy responsibilities and limited freedom. Life under Ottoman rule was not easy. Christians faced social and legal disadvantages, including restrictions on building churches, issues of taxation, and limitations on political participation. Yet the church adapted to these constraints with resilience. Monasteries continued to serve as centers of spirituality and learning. They preserved ancient liturgical traditions, copied manuscripts, and provided education to successive generations. The endurance of these monastic centers allowed orthodoxy to retain a strong sense of identity despite political upheaval. Interestingly, Ottoman rule also insulated the Orthodox Church from Western influence. Because political contact with Catholic Europe became more restricted, the cultural distance between the two traditions increased further. Western missionaries occasionally attempted to spread Catholicism in the region, but these efforts were often viewed with suspicion by both the Ottomans and Orthodox leaders. Orthodox identity deepened during this period. The Church's memory of the schism, the trauma of the Fourth Crusade, and the fall of Constantinople all became part of the narrative of endurance. This narrative emphasized the idea of orthodoxy as a faith that survived against overwhelming odds. It nurtured a sense of spiritual continuity that connected believers across time and geography. The centuries following 1453 were challenging, but they were also formative. Orthodoxy became more closely tied to language, ethnicity, and local tradition. The Russian, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Greek Orthodox communities all developed stronger national identities, rooted in their shared faith. In a world where the empire that once defined orthodoxy had vanished, the Church emerged as the guardian of a cultural and spiritual heritage that could not be destroyed by conquest. This resilience helped shape Eastern Christianity for centuries and made the idea of reconciliation with Rome appear even more distant. The churches were no longer simply separated by theology. they now existed in completely different political worlds. While the Orthodox Church adapted to life under Ottoman rule, the Western Church entered a period of profound transformation. The Renaissance brought a new wave of intellectual energy, artistic innovation, and philosophical inquiry that reshaped Western Europe. The Catholic Church played a central role in this cultural revival, sponsoring art, education, and scientific work. Yet these developments also changed how Western Christians understood their faith and their place in the world. Western Europe experienced rapid economic growth as trade networks expanded and exploration increased. The rise of merchant classes and stronger, centralized monarchies contributed to a sense of momentum that contrasted sharply with the political stagnation of the former Byzantine world. The Catholic Church, despite internal challenges, remained a powerful institution capable of influencing politics, culture, and international relations. Theologically, Western thought continued to evolve. Scholasticism matured, and universities became hubs of debate on philosophy, law, and science. The works of Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and other major thinkers shaped Catholic theology in ways that further distinguished it from the mystical traditions of the East. The intellectual environment of the West encouraged systematic inquiry and often blended theological concepts with emerging fields like natural philosophy. At the same time, the Catholic Church extended its influence globally. Explorers and missionaries traveled to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, spreading Christianity to new populations. The Church became increasingly international, and the papacy grew more involved in global political affairs. This expansion reinforced the Western belief that Catholicism was the universal expression of Christianity, guided by the Pope as the spiritual leader of all Christians. The Renaissance also saw growing criticism of the Church, leading to calls for reform that would eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation. This new schism within Western Christianity reshaped the religious landscape of Europe and forced Catholic leaders to defend their traditions more vigorously. In doing so, they developed clearer distinctions between Catholic identity and other Christian expressions, Orthodox or Protestant. The West's transformation during this period made reconciliation with the East even more challenging. Catholic leaders saw themselves as inheritors of a global mission, while Orthodox leaders focused on preserving their traditions under foreign rule. These divergent experiences deepened the sense that the two churches inhabited not only different theological worlds, but entirely different historical trajectories. As Western power grew and Eastern stability weakened, the balance that once allowed for meaningful dialogue faded. The schism no longer rested on past disagreements alone. It became reinforced by the vastly different futures each tradition pursued. Segment 3. The rise of national churches and the fragmentation of Christian unity. As both East and West entered new historical eras, the concept of Christian unity shifted radically. Instead of one universal Christian world led by a single empire or papacy, Christianity fragmented into multiple national traditions. This transformation further solidified the schism, reshaping the landscape of global Christianity in lasting ways. In the Orthodox world, national churches gained prominence as political states emerged or reclaimed independence from foreign rule. Russia, in particular, rose as the largest and most influential Orthodox power. After the fall of Constantinople, some Russian thinkers began describing Moscow as the Third Rome, suggesting that the responsibility for protecting orthodoxy had passed from Rome to Constantinople and finally to Moscow. This belief created a sense of divine mission that further separated Eastern and Western identities. Other Orthodox regions, such as Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania, developed strong national identities centered around their churches. These communities preserved their languages, customs, and liturgical traditions in ways that reflected both religious devotion and cultural heritage. Orthodoxy became intertwined with national history, making the idea of accepting papal authority even less appealing. Unity with Rome would not only require theological compromise, it would require surrendering cultural independence. In the West, the Protestant Reformation fractured Catholic unity. Despite this, the Catholic Church continued to emphasize papal authority as the cornerstone of its identity. The Council of Trent, held in the 16th century, clarified Catholic doctrine and reaffirmed the central role of the Pope. This strengthened Catholic cohesion, but also hardened the distinctions between the Western Church and other Christian traditions. The emergence of Protestantism altered Western attitudes toward Orthodoxy. Some reformers admired certain aspects of Eastern Christianity, such as its emphasis on mystery and its resistance to centralized papal authority. However, these contacts remained limited. For the Catholic Church, Orthodoxy became one of several Christian traditions outside its fold, rather than a sibling church with which reconciliation was urgently needed. The growth of national churches on both sides made the idea of universal Christian unity difficult to imagine. The East embraced a model of independent patriarchates and autocephalous churches, each culturally distinct but spiritually aligned. The West held to a centralized structure with the Pope at its core. These divergent visions of what the Church should be reinforced the schism as a permanent reality. No longer was the division simply a result of past conflict. It became rooted in national identity, political independence, and cultural pride. Each tradition came to see itself as complete without the other. By the early modern era, the Great Schism had evolved far beyond a dispute between medieval leaders. It had become a defining feature of global Christianity, shaping the development of nations, cultures, and spiritual communities across the world. During the early modern period, as Europe entered an age of exploration and political change, new attempts at dialogue between East and West emerged. Much of this engagement came through Catholic missionary efforts. The Catholic Church, energized by the Counter-Reformation, sought to strengthen its influence across the world. While missionaries focused primarily on Asia, the Americas, and Africa, a significant effort was directed toward the Orthodox East. Jesuits, Capuchins, and other Catholic orders traveled to regions under Ottoman control, including Greece, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Their goal was to persuade local Orthodox communities to reunite with the Catholic Church. Some missionaries approached this task with genuine theological curiosity and respect. They learned Greek, studied Orthodox texts, and engaged with local clergy. Others, however, used aggressive tactics or presented Catholic doctrine in ways that felt dismissive of Orthodox tradition. These efforts produced mixed reactions. Some Orthodox believers, especially those in remote areas without strong clerical leadership, found the missionaries' teachings intriguing. A few communities entered into communion with Rome, creating small groups known as Eastern Catholics or Uniats. These communities adopted Catholic theology while retaining Orthodox liturgy. The Catholic Church saw them as successful examples of reunion. But for many Orthodox leaders, these missionary efforts confirmed long-held fears about Catholic intentions. They saw the creation of Uniate communities as an attempt to divide and weaken Orthodoxy from within. The fact that missionaries operated under Ottoman rule made the situation even more sensitive. The patriarchs of Constantinople worried that Catholic influence might provoke political suspicion from the Ottoman government or threaten the stability of Orthodox communities. Orthodox councils responded firmly. They condemned proselytizing efforts and issued statements defending Orthodox theology. They argued that true unity could be achieved only if the Catholic Church abandoned the teachings and practices that caused the schism. These reactions shaped the attitudes of Orthodox believers for generations. Catholic missionaries were often regarded not as partners in dialogue, but as competitors seeking to reshape ancient traditions. The Catholic Church interpreted Orthodox resistance as stubbornness, while the Orthodox saw Catholic persistence as disrespectful of their spiritual heritage. This mismatch made meaningful dialogue difficult. Even when Catholic missionaries tried to engage respectfully, they often underestimated the weight of historical trauma, especially the memory of the Fourth Crusade, which remained a powerful symbol of betrayal. Overall, missionary encounters in this period produced more tension than reconciliation. They reinforced the sense that Catholicism and Orthodoxy were separate worlds, each confident in its own path. Despite moments of goodwill, the deep cultural and theological divide remained intact. After the fall of Constantinople, the center of Orthodox political power shifted northward, particularly to Russia. The Russian principalities, once under Mongol domination, gradually unified around Moscow. By the 16th century, Moscow emerged as a central force in Eastern Christianity. With the Byzantine Empire gone, many Russians believed it was their spiritual mission to preserve and protect Orthodoxy. The idea of Moscow as the Third Rome captured the imagination of Russian rulers and clergy. They argued that Rome had fallen into error, Constantinople had fallen to foreign conquerors, and Moscow alone remained as the guardian of the true faith. This belief did not represent official doctrine, but it influenced Russian self-perception deeply. It encouraged the idea that Russia held a unique responsibility to defend Orthodoxy from Catholic and Muslim influence. Russian religious life during this period reflected a strong emphasis on preserving ancient rituals and resisting any changes that might resemble Western influence. When Patriarch Nikon attempted reforms in the 17th century to align Russian practices with those of earlier Byzantine tradition, it sparked a major schism within Russia itself. Many believers rejected what they perceived as unnecessary innovation and broke away as old believers. This reaction showed how deeply rooted the desire to maintain Orthodox identity had become. If internal reforms could provoke such resistance, it is easy to understand why Russian Orthodoxy viewed Catholic attempts at union with suspicion. Russian clergy produced writings that defended Orthodox theology and criticized Western doctrines, especially papal primacy. Politically, Russia and Catholic nations often competed for influence in Eastern Europe. Conflicts in Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic regions brought Orthodox and Catholic populations into direct tension. The establishment of uniate churches in areas like Ukraine created further resentment. Many Orthodox believers saw these communities as evidence of Catholic expansionism under the guise of reunion. Russian rulers, particularly the Tsars, sometimes used Orthodoxy as a tool of national unity. Their support for the Church strengthened their political legitimacy and tied religious identity to state power. As a result, the distinction between Orthodoxy and Catholicism became not only a theological matter, but a political and cultural boundary. By the 18th century, Russia had become the most powerful Orthodox state in the world. Its growing influence shaped the attitudes of Orthodox Christians everywhere. For many, Russia's strength served as proof that Orthodoxy could thrive without Rome. This confidence further reduced any desire for reconciliation and solidified the belief that the schism represented a permanent separation rather than a temporary dispute. as Europe entered the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, Western intellectual life underwent dramatic changes. Philosophers such as Descartes, Locke, and Voltaire emphasized reason, individual rights, and secular approaches to knowledge. These developments reshaped the cultural landscape of Western Europe, influencing politics, science, and even religion. The Catholic Church struggled to respond to these changes. Some thinkers attempted to harmonize reason and faith, while others criticized the Church's authority. The Enlightenment weakened the political power of Catholic institutions in several countries and encouraged new ideas about governance and human rights. Although the Church remained influential, its role was changing. In the East, the Ottoman Empire controlled much of the Orthodox world, which insulated it from many Enlightenment influences. While some Orthodox intellectuals eventually engaged with Enlightenment ideas, the movement did not reshape Eastern society to the same extent. Orthodox theology continued to emphasize tradition, liturgical life, and the writings of the early Church Fathers. This divergence created another layer of separation. Western Christianity, influenced by modern philosophy, developed new approaches to education, law, and political theory. Eastern Christianity continued to view the past as the key to understanding the present. Rather than moving toward modernity, it focused on stability and continuity. Western travelers who visited the Orthodox world often described it as mysterious, stagnant, or overly traditional. Their writings reinforced the stereotype that the East lacked progress. Meanwhile, Orthodox observers viewed the West as increasingly secular, overly rational, and distant from the spiritual heart of Christianity. These mutual perceptions widened the cultural gap. Even when diplomatic or theological dialogue occurred, participants approached discussions with assumptions shaped by centuries of estrangement. The idea of unity felt unrealistic because the two worlds no longer shared a common intellectual foundation. By the end of the 18th century, the schism had survived political upheavals, religious reformations, and shifts in global power. What kept it alive was no longer just theology. It was the accumulated cultural differences, emotional wounds, and centuries-long development of distinct Christian identities. In this period, the Great Schism transformed into a stable feature of global Christianity. Both East and West had become certain of their paths. Neither saw the other as an essential partner in shaping the future of the faith. The divide was now woven into the fabric of their histories. As the 19th century unfolded, Europe underwent dramatic political and social change. The rise of nationalism transformed the relationship between states, churches, and cultural identities. This new force added another layer to the already complex divide between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. For centuries, Christian identity had been shaped primarily by theological affiliation and imperial allegiance. Now, national identity began to take center stage. In Eastern Europe and the Balkans, Orthodox identity became closely linked to emerging national movements. The decline of the Ottoman Empire created opportunities for Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania to pursue independence. Their struggles were not only political, but also cultural and religious. The Orthodox Church played a central role in preserving local languages, traditions, and collective memory during centuries of Ottoman rule. When independence movements gained momentum, the Church served as a unifying force that helped shape national consciousness. This development strengthened the idea that Orthodoxy was inseparable from national identity. For newly independent states, the Church symbolized continuity, resilience, and cultural authenticity. In Greece, the Church helped fuel the desire for liberation during the Greek War of Independence. In Serbia and Bulgaria, Orthodox institutions supported educational and linguistic revival. These movements reinforced the belief that Orthodox Christianity represented the spiritual heart of each nation. At the same time, Catholic influence in Eastern Europe was often associated with foreign power. The Austro-Hungarian Empire contained large Catholic populations and exerted political pressure on Orthodox communities, especially in regions like Croatia, Slovakia, and Transylvania. Catholic missionary efforts also continued, sometimes appearing intertwined with political agendas. As a result, many Orthodox nationalists viewed Catholicism as a threat to cultural sovereignty. In the West, nationalism also reshaped Catholic identity. The papacy, which once wielded significant political power, faced new challenges as modern states asserted their independence. Movements like Italian unification weakened the papal states and reduced the Pope's temporal authority. The Catholic Church responded by emphasizing papal spiritual authority, reinforcing its distinction not only from Protestantism, but also from Orthodoxy. The parallel rise of nationalism on both sides deepened the schism. In the East, Orthodoxy became a symbol of national pride. In the West, Catholic identity became more tightly bound to loyalty to Rome. Instead of drawing the two traditions together, nationalism created competing cultural narratives that pushed them further apart. By the end of the 19th century, the schism was no longer simply a religious disagreement. It was embedded in the political aspirations and national identities of entire populations. This made reconciliation far more complex, because unity would now require not only theological agreement, but a reimagining of deeply held cultural loyalties. The 19th and early 20th centuries brought waves of revolution, industrialization, and modernization that reshaped societies across Europe. These changes affected both Catholic and Orthodox communities in ways that further complicated the path toward reconciliation. As people moved from rural villages to industrial cities, traditional social structures weakened. Monasteries lost influence in some regions. Literacy increased, and political ideologies such as liberalism, socialism, and nationalism challenged the authority of religious institutions. In the Orthodox world, modernization took uneven paths. Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania gradually developed modern states with new legal systems, schools, and bureaucracies. The Orthodox Church adapted to these changes, but often struggled to maintain the same level of influence it held under Ottoman rule. New ideas about governance and individual rights sometimes clashed with traditional Orthodox teachings on community and spiritual authority. Russia experienced an especially turbulent transformation. Rapid industrialization and political unrest led to the Russian Revolution of 1917, which dismantled the monarchy and replaced it with a communist regime that was hostile to religion. The Russian Orthodox Church faced persecution, closures of churches, and the execution or imprisonment of clergy. This created a new dynamic in the schism. While Catholic communities also faced challenges in various countries, the Orthodox Church experienced an unprecedented level of suppression in the Soviet Union. Despite this repression, Orthodoxy survived underground and in exile. Russian emigre communities established churches in Europe and North America, spreading Orthodox spirituality to new regions. Their writings and theological contributions brought Eastern Christian thought into dialogue with Western intellectual movements in ways that had not occurred for centuries. In the Catholic world, revolutions in France, Italy, and Mexico also challenged the Church's authority, though not with the same intensity as in the Soviet Union. Catholic institutions faced restrictions, lost property, and struggled with new secular governments. At the same time, Catholic social teaching emerged as a powerful response to industrialization. Encyclicals like Rerum Novarum addressed workers' rights, poverty, and justice, shaping modern Catholic identity. These parallel transformations created new opportunities for dialogue, but also new obstacles. Orthodox churches weakened by political repression had fewer resources for international engagement. Catholic institutions, while strong in some countries, struggled with internal debates about modernity and secularism. The result was a paradox. Modernization brought the two traditions into closer geographic and intellectual contact, especially in diaspora communities. Yet the political upheavals of the era made official reconciliation more difficult. Both churches were focused on survival and adaptation, not large-scale theological dialogue. By the early 20th century, the schism remained firmly in place. The world was changing rapidly, but the separation between East and West persisted, shaped now by the pressures of revolution, industrialization, and global political shifts. As European powers expanded their influence across the world in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Christianity underwent a profound global transformation. Missionaries traveled to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, establishing churches in regions far from Europe. This expansion introduced new cultural contexts and new challenges that influenced how both Catholic and Orthodox communities understood themselves and their place in the world. The Catholic Church became a global institution. Missionaries founded schools, hospitals, and churches in colonized regions, spreading Catholic influence across continents. In many areas, Catholicism became intertwined with colonial administration, which created both opportunities and tensions. The Pope's authority extended deeper into new territories, reinforcing the idea that Catholicism was a universal faith with a centralized leadership capable of guiding diverse cultures. Orthodox Christianity also spread beyond its traditional boundaries, though more slowly. Immigrants from Greece, Russia, Lebanon, and the Balkans established Orthodox parishes in North America, South America, and Australia. These communities preserved their traditions while adapting to new social environments. In some regions, Orthodoxy grew rapidly, attracting converts who were drawn to its liturgy, spirituality, and sense of historical continuity. Despite this global expansion, the schism remained intact. In fact, new forms of separation emerged. Catholic and Orthodox missionaries sometimes entered the same regions, competing for influence. Local populations often found the differences between the traditions confusing, especially when they encountered conflicting teachings from groups that both claimed continuity with the early church. Global Christianity also brought new theological challenges. Encounters with non-Christian religions raised questions about universal salvation, divine revelation, and the nature of mission. These discussions sometimes highlighted the distinct approaches of Catholic and Orthodox theology. Catholic teaching emphasized the universal authority of the Pope and the importance of missionary work. Orthodox theology focused more on the mystical experience of God and the role of the Church as a living tradition. At the same time, Protestant missionary movements grew rapidly, adding another dimension to the Christian world. Protestant churches often presented themselves as alternatives to both Catholic and Orthodox traditions, emphasizing personal interpretation of Scripture and rejecting hierarchical structures. This expanding religious landscape made the Great Schism seem both smaller and larger. Smaller, because the Christian world was no longer defined solely by the rivalry between East and West. Larger, because in a global context, the differences between the two ancient traditions stood out more clearly. By the early 20th century, Christianity had become a worldwide faith with diverse expressions. Yet the divide between Catholicism and Orthodoxy remained one of its most enduring features. The increasing complexity of global Christianity made reconciliation more challenging, even as new opportunities for dialogue began to emerge. The 20th century brought new opportunities for dialogue between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. After centuries of mutual suspicion and cultural distance, global events encouraged Christians to reconsider the value of unity. 2 world wars devastated Europe, leaving millions dead and weakening the old political structures that had shaped the schism. Industrialization, technological change, and the rise of secular ideologies dramatically altered the social landscape. These transformations encouraged many Christian leaders to think differently about the future. The ecumenical movement, which sought dialogue and cooperation among Christian traditions, gained momentum. Protestant churches were early participants in this movement, forming organizations that promoted unity, but the Orthodox and Catholic churches soon became involved as well. For the Orthodox Church, the collapse of old empires and the rise of new nation-states created opportunities for broader international dialogue. Orthodox leaders in diaspora communities, especially in Western Europe and North America, found themselves interacting more frequently with Catholics and Protestants. These encounters often broke down stereotypes and created personal relationships that softened old attitudes. The Catholic Church also began re-examining its approach to other Christian traditions. Although the papacy still maintained the belief in Roman primacy, new currents within Catholic thought emphasized engagement, dialogue, and humility. This shift culminated in the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, a major turning point in the modern history of the Church. Vatican II encouraged Catholics to recognize the spiritual richness of Orthodox Christianity, acknowledging that the Eastern churches preserved ancient traditions worthy of respect. The Council's decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, explicitly called for renewed dialogue with the Orthodox Church. It recognized that the schism had deep historical roots and that both sides shared responsibility. It emphasized that unity would require patience, mutual respect, and a willingness to understand each tradition on its own terms. Orthodox leaders responded with cautious openness. While many welcomed the new tone from Rome, others worried that dialogue might revive old pressures toward papal domination. Still, the atmosphere was more hopeful than at any time since the medieval period. Practical cooperation increased in areas such as theological education, social work, and advocacy for persecuted Christians. This new spirit of ecumenism represented a significant shift. After nearly a millennium of separation, East and West were finally talking to each other in meaningful ways. The 20th century opened a door that had long seemed sealed, offering the possibility that the Great Schism might someday be healed. Yet despite this progress, deep obstacles remained, obstacles that centuries of conflict, identity, and doctrine had firmly rooted in both traditions. One of the most symbolic events of the 20th century was the mutual lifting of the excommunications of 1054. For centuries, the moment when papal legates placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia had stood as a powerful symbol of division. In 1965, nearly 1,000 years later, Pope Paul VI and Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras I issued a historic joint declaration lifting those excommunications. This act did not magically restore unity, nor did it erase the theological disagreements that contributed to the schism, but it represented a significant change in how both churches viewed each other. For the first time in many centuries, leaders from both traditions acknowledged that the conflict of 1054 was shaped by political pressures, cultural misunderstandings, and the actions of individuals rather than fundamental differences in the gospel itself. The declaration emphasized reconciliation, charity, and mutual respect. Both leaders expressed sorrow for the past and a desire for a new future in which cooperation would replace hostility. The public gestures of friendship, such as their meetings in Jerusalem and Constantinople, sent a powerful message to Christians worldwide that the two churches were no longer enemies but brothers separated by history. This moment inspired hope within many communities. Theologians, clergy, and lay people on both sides began participating in joint commissions to explore areas of commonality and doctrinal difference. These discussions clarified misunderstandings that had persisted for centuries. For example, theologians found that the dispute over the Filioque clause was less about contradicting doctrine than about how each tradition expressed the same mystery in different ways. However, the lifting of excommunications also revealed the limits of symbolic gestures. While many Catholics embraced the new era of dialogue, Orthodox reactions were mixed. Some saw the event as a positive step, while others feared it might lead to unwanted concessions. Within Orthodoxy, particularly in more conservative communities, suspicion of Catholic intentions remained strong. Even so, the significance of 1965 cannot be overstated. The act demonstrated that healing the schism was not impossible. It showed that both sides could acknowledge past wounds, extend forgiveness, and seek a better path forward. Although unity was not achieved, the excommunications that had stood as barriers for nearly a millennium were finally set aside. It was a moment of humility and hope, one that began to rewrite the emotional history of the schism and open new doors for future reconciliation. Despite the progress made during the 20th century, several deep challenges prevented full reconciliation between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. These challenges were not simply doctrinal disagreements. They were rooted in centuries of cultural development, political experience, and spiritual identity. Understanding these barriers is essential to understanding why the schism endures. The most significant issue remained papal primacy. The Catholic Church maintained that the Pope, as the successor of St. Peter, holds universal jurisdiction over all Christians. This belief, reaffirmed by Vatican I and Vatican II, remains at the core of Catholic ecclesiology. Orthodoxy acknowledges the Pope's historical primacy of honor, but rejects any claim of universal authority. For the Orthodox Church, authority is shared collectively among patriarchs and bishops, reflecting the early Church's conciliar structure. This difference shapes how each tradition understands unity itself. Catholics imagine unity as a single authoritative structure with the Pope at the center. Orthodox Christians see unity as a communion of autocephalous churches that share doctrine and sacraments, but govern themselves independently. Reconciling these models requires not just theological dialogue, but also a shift in how each tradition views its identity and mission. Other issues also remain significant. The Filioque clause continues to be debated, even though modern theologians recognize that both East and West affirm the same essential belief about the Holy Spirit. Differences in liturgical practice, clerical celibacy, sacramental theology, and canon law also complicate discussions. The Orthodox Church often fears that reunion would require abandoning cherished traditions that define its spiritual life. Historical memory presents another barrier. The trauma of the Fourth Crusade still influences Orthodox perceptions of the West, especially in regions that directly suffered from Latin occupation. Meanwhile, Catholics sometimes struggle to understand why events from centuries ago continue to shape modern Orthodox attitudes. These emotional wounds cannot be resolved through theological argument alone. Political tensions also hinder progress. Relations between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Vatican, for example, are influenced by geopolitical concerns, especially in Eastern Europe. Conflicts over territory, diaspora communities, and jurisdiction complicate dialogue. Finally, internal diversity within both traditions makes agreement difficult. Some Orthodox churches are more open to dialogue than others. Within Catholicism, different theological schools and cultural contexts shape attitudes toward reunion. Despite these challenges, the 20th century marked real progress. Dialogue deepened. Mutual respect increased. The excommunications were lifted, yet the path to unity remains long and complex. The schism persists because it reflects not just theological differences, but centuries of lived experience, cultural divergence, and deeply held identity. Still, the door to reconciliation is no longer closed. The conversations that began in the 20th century continue today, offering cautious hope for the future. In the 21st century, globalization has reshaped how people interact, communicate, and understand one another. This new environment offers both challenges and opportunities for the relationship between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. For the first time in history, ordinary believers from both traditions regularly meet in schools, workplaces, and online communities. These encounters reduce the sense of mystery and unfamiliarity that had defined East-West relations for centuries. Church leaders also recognize the importance of cooperation in addressing global issues such as poverty, migration, war, and moral questions raised by rapid technological change. Catholic and Orthodox representatives have participated in conferences, humanitarian projects, and interfaith initiatives that bring them into closer contact. These efforts highlight shared concerns and demonstrate the practical benefits of working together. One of the most encouraging developments has been the frequent meetings between popes and patriarchs. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis all made significant efforts to strengthen relations with Orthodox leaders. These encounters have included joint prayers, public statements of friendship, and collaborative responses to crises, such as the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. Theological dialogue has also continued through joint commissions. Participants have explored historical misunderstandings, clarified doctrinal points, and examined how early church traditions might guide modern unity. The conversations are often slow and complex, but they represent real progress compared to the centuries of silence that preceded them. Despite these advancements, dialogue remains fragile. Many Orthodox believers worry that too much openness to Rome could weaken their traditions or lead to subtle forms of Catholic influence. Some Catholic communities, meanwhile, struggle to understand the depth of Orthodox concerns about papal primacy. Yet overall, the 21st century has seen a more constructive and respectful atmosphere than at any other time since the schism began. Globalization has not erased the divide, but it has created new opportunities for trust building. For the first time in many generations, Christians from both traditions can imagine a future where cooperation is normal rather than exceptional. The challenge lies in turning these hopeful encounters into lasting change. Even as dialogue improves, several deep tensions continue to shape Catholic, Orthodox relations in a modern era. Many of these challenges are rooted not in theology, but in politics, ecclesiastical boundaries, and questions of authority. They reveal how closely intertwined church life remains with national and regional interests. One of the most sensitive issues is the status of Eastern Catholic churches, often called uniate churches. These communities follow Eastern liturgical traditions, but are in communion with Rome. To many Orthodox leaders, their existence symbolizes past Catholic attempts to draw Orthodox believers away from their tradition. As a result, discussions involving Eastern Catholics are often tense. While the Catholic Church views these communities as bridges between East and West, the Orthodox often see them as obstacles to genuine reconciliation. Another major tension involves territorial jurisdiction. As Orthodox and Catholic communities expand globally, especially in diaspora settings, both traditions establish parishes in the same regions. This overlap sometimes leads to disputes over which church has legitimate authority in a particular area. These conflicts can escalate quickly because they involve not only spiritual concerns, but also political and cultural ties. The most significant political challenge in recent decades has been the relationship between the Vatican and the Russian Orthodox Church. Russia, home to the largest Orthodox population in the world, plays an outsized role in shaping Orthodox attitudes toward Catholicism. Relations between the two often fluctuate based on geopolitical conditions. For example, conflicts in Ukraine have intensified tensions. When Ukraine established an autocephalous Orthodox Church recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, the Russian Church reacted strongly, viewing the move as politically motivated. These political pressures complicate theological dialogue. Even when Catholic and Orthodox theologians agree on many points, political realities can prevent progress. Church leaders must consider not only doctrinal truth, but also national interests, historical grievances, and the expectations of their communities. In addition to geopolitics, internal diversity within each tradition poses challenges. Some Catholic groups advocate for rapid reunion, while others emphasize strict adherence to papal authority. Some Orthodox communities welcome dialogue, while others insist that any concession to Rome would compromise their authenticity. These internal debates make it difficult for church leaders to present unified positions. Despite these obstacles, moments of cooperation continue. Joint efforts to defend persecuted Christians, promote peace, and address ethical issues demonstrate that shared values can transcend political tensions. Yet the path toward unity remains uneven, shaped by forces that extend far beyond theology. Today, almost 1,000 years after the Great Schism, the Catholic and Orthodox churches remain separate but increasingly engaged in conversation. While full institutional unity still appears distant, meaningful progress has been made. Understanding the current landscape involves recognizing both what has changed and what remains firmly rooted in history. One positive development is the growing emphasis on mutual respect. Both traditions now acknowledge each other as authentic Christian communities that share the sacraments, apostolic succession, and early church heritage. This represents a major shift from past centuries, when each side often questioned the legitimacy of the other. Modern dialogue focuses on practical cooperation and theological clarity. Joint statements have addressed issues such as the nature of the church, the role of bishops, and the meaning of synodality. Many theologians believe that the future of unity lies not in one tradition dominating the other, but in finding a model of communion that respects both papal primacy and Orthodox conciliarity. At the same time, significant challenges remain. Papal authority continues to be the central obstacle. While some Orthodox leaders acknowledge the historical role of the Pope, they hesitate to accept any form of universal jurisdiction. Catholics, on the other hand, struggle to imagine unity without a clear center of authority. Reconciling these visions requires deep theological creativity and mutual trust. Cultural factors also continue to shape the discussion. The Orthodox world remains diverse, with different patriarchates holding different priorities. Some, like the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, actively promote dialogue. Others, like the Russian Orthodox Church, approach reconciliation more cautiously due to political and historical concerns. Despite these divisions, younger generations of Christians often express openness to cooperation. Increased travel, academic exchange, and digital communication have helped break down old stereotypes. Many believers now appreciate the beauty of both traditions. The depth of Orthodox liturgy and spirituality alongside the global reach and intellectual heritage of Catholicism. The future of unity will likely unfold slowly. It may emerge not from dramatic declarations, but from gradual steps, shared prayer, and continued collaboration on issues that affect all Christians. The schism, born from centuries of misunderstanding and conflict, cannot be undone quickly. Yet the possibility remains alive. The progress of the last century suggests that unity is not impossible, only difficult. The journey continues with hope, humility, and a recognition of the profound history that brought the Christian world to where it stands today. The Great Schism endures not because of a single dispute or a single moment in history, but because it became woven into the cultural memory of millions of people across continents and centuries. Even today, many Christians in both East and West inherit stories, assumptions, and emotional narratives shaped by what happened in 1054 and the centuries that followed. The schism influences how Christians understand their past, their identity, and the spiritual landscape of the world. One reason the memory of the schism remains powerful is that it was never simply a religious disagreement. It reflected profound differences in language, culture, symbolism, and political experience. These differences created communities that prayed in different ways, expressed theology differently, and lived under very different forms of government. The East developed within the framework of the Byzantine Empire with its ceremonial court life, emphasis on mystical theology, and strong connection to ancient Greek culture. The West developed within feudal Europe, shaped by Latin legalism, the growth of scholastic thought, and the evolving authority of the papacy. These distinct environments produced unique forms of Christian imagination. Icons, for example, became central to Orthodox spirituality in ways that shaped daily religious experience. Western Christians, by contrast, embraced more narrative art and emphasized different devotional practices. Even small differences in liturgy, fasting, and worship came to symbolize broader cultural divides. Over time, these patterns solidified into traditions that believers learned from childhood, carried into adulthood, and passed forward through generations. The trauma of major events, especially the Fourth Crusade, amplified these emotional boundaries. For Orthodox Christians, the sack of Constantinople remains a vivid symbol of betrayal and suffering. It represents not merely the failure of Christian unity, but the destruction of a civilization that had protected the faith for 1,000 years. For Catholics, the event is often understood as a tragic misunderstanding, not a defining moment of identity. This difference in memory makes dialogue challenging because each tradition tells its story from a different emotional vantage point. In addition to cultural memory, the modern world still reflects the schism in political and social ways. Nations in Eastern Europe often see orthodoxy as a cornerstone of identity, connecting their past struggles to their present aspirations. Catholic nations carry their own historical experiences, shaped by interactions with Rome, the Reformation, and the development of global missionary traditions. All these memories, liturgical, cultural, historical, and emotional, shape how Christians understand the schism today. It is not simply a question of doctrine, but a complex, layered legacy that continues to influence how millions of people view themselves and their neighbors. The schism matters because it has become part of how Christian identity itself is understood. The Great Schism is often presented as a disagreement about theology, but its deeper significance lies in what it reveals about the relationship between religion, culture, and power. The history of the schism shows that spiritual unity cannot be separated from political realities. It also demonstrates how cultural differences, even when subtle, can shape the future of entire civilizations. One lesson is that political pressure can influence religious decisions in ways that last far longer than the moment itself. The schism grew during periods when both the papacy and the Byzantine Empire were trying to strengthen their authority. When the legates placed the bull of excommunication on the altar in 1054, they did so within a context where the papacy was asserting itself against secular rulers in the West, while the Byzantine Empire was struggling to maintain influence in the East. These political currents colored every theological debate and made compromise harder. Another lesson is that cultural distance can create misunderstandings even when the underlying beliefs are not dramatically different. The filioque clause, papal primacy, and liturgical practices were often interpreted through cultural assumptions rather than pure doctrine. Latin and Greek Christians approached theology with different intellectual tools, different languages, and different spiritual sensibilities. These differences did not have to lead to division, but without careful communication, they became symbols of estrangement. The schism also demonstrates how events beyond theology can harden religious boundaries. The Crusades, especially the Fourth Crusade, reshaped Christian history by turning military conflict into spiritual trauma. The fall of Constantinople in 1204 introduced wounds that no theological council could fully heal. The memory of such events persisted across centuries, influencing how Orthodox Christians viewed Western intentions even when Catholics approached dialogue with sincere goodwill. The persistence of tradition is another key lesson. Both Catholicism and Orthodoxy preserved ancient practices in ways that shaped their identity. Traditions provided continuity, but also made adaptation difficult. When unity efforts required compromise, each community feared losing something essential. This tension between continuity and change appears in many religious movements. But in the case of the schism, it became a defining factor. Perhaps the most important lesson is that unity requires more than shared beliefs. It requires trust, communication, patience, and a willingness to understand another community's way of life. The schism shows what happens when these elements break down. It illustrates how easily small misunderstandings can grow into large divisions when reinforced by fear, pride, or political ambition. Ultimately, the Great Schism teaches that religion exists within history, and history is shaped by human decisions. Those decisions can create unity or division. The legacy of the schism invites Christians today to reflect on the responsibilities that come with preserving faith across cultures and centuries. Looking ahead, the future of Catholic-Orthodox relations remains open. While full institutional reunion may take decades or even longer, the 21st century has shown that progress is possible. The question now is not simply whether unity will occur, but what unity should look like in a world far different from the medieval era when the schism began. One realistic future scenario is a gradual deepening of communion without complete administrative merger. Many theologians argue that unity does not require identical governance structures. Instead, it could involve recognition of sacraments, shared participation in councils, and coordinated responses to global challenges. This form of unity respects Orthodox conciliarity while allowing Catholics to maintain their understanding of papal leadership in a way that does not impose authority over the East. Practical cooperation will likely grow. Both churches face similar challenges: secularization, declining religious participation in some regions, the need for strong moral leadership, and the responsibility to support Christian minorities facing persecution. Joint efforts on humanitarian issues may continue to build trust and show that unity is not only theological, but also lived through service. At the same time, major obstacles remain. Papal primacy is still the most difficult issue. While popes have shown greater openness to explaining primacy in terms of service rather than domination, the concept remains sensitive for Orthodox communities shaped by centuries of independence. Another challenge is the internal diversity of the Orthodox world. Different patriarchates hold different priorities and may not agree on what unity should look like. Cultural memory will also continue to influence the conversation. For many Orthodox believers, 1204 is still a living symbol of Western interference. For many Catholics, the schism is a tragedy, but not a central part of identity. These differing perspectives make dialogue delicate, demanding empathy and historical awareness. Despite these challenges, the possibility of unity endures. Many scholars, clergy, and laypeople on both sides believe that the future of Christianity benefits from cooperation rather than separation. Younger generations, who travel more and communicate across cultures, tend to focus less on old divisions and more on shared values. Ultimately, the meaning of unity today is not about recreating a medieval structure or declaring victory for one side. It is about recognizing the spiritual heritage shared by millions of Christians and finding ways to express that unity through mutual respect, shared mission, and ongoing conversation. The Great Schism began with disagreements, misunderstandings, and political pressures. Its legacy continues because history has shaped the identities of East and West in powerful ways. But history also shows that relationships can evolve. The story of the schism is not only a story of division. It is also a story of endurance, resilience, and the ongoing human effort to seek understanding across even the deepest boundaries. You've just traveled through nearly 1,000 years of events that shaped the Great Schism, a division that changed the future of Christianity and influenced the political and cultural paths of entire civilizations. Today you heard how language, culture, power, and misunderstanding slowly pulled East and West apart. You saw how fear and pride can turn dialogue into conflict, how traditions grow stronger under pressure, and how a single moment, like the sack of Constantinople, can shape centuries of memory. The moral of this story is simple but powerful. When people stop listening to each other, when pride outweighs patience, and when fear replaces trust, even communities with shared roots can drift so far apart that reunion becomes almost impossible. History reminds us that unity is fragile, and once broken, it takes generations of effort to repair. But you also heard moments of hope, councils that tried to bring healing, leaders who reached across divides, and modern dialogue that shows reconciliation is still possible. The past may be heavy, but the future is never closed. Thank you for spending this time with History Teller YT. If you enjoyed this journey and want more stories that bring the past to life, make sure to come back for the next episode. There's still so many worlds to explore, so many lessons to uncover, and so many stories waiting to be told. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep traveling through history.